Welcome to Classic Trials. If you're new here, my name is Alita. I'm a lawyer licensed in California and DC, and on this channel, we make sense of the law one bite at a time. In this series, we observe and analyze the play-by-play of some of the biggest trials that have shaped the public consciousness of the American judicial system. In this season, we're working our way through the case of California v. Erik and Lyle Menendez. Growing up in Princeton, New Jersey, and then Beverly Hills, California, these young men had everything they could ever want, or so it seemed, until one night on August 20th, 1989, they approached Jose and Kitty Menendez with newly purchased shotguns. Put on trial for murdering their own parents, they claimed self-defense, arguing they were terrorized in their own home by abusive parents until they could take no more. Which argument is more convincing? Come join and see for yourself. All right, you guys. Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Happy Tuesday. I was about to say happy Monday. I caught myself. Usually these are on Mondays, these Menendez Mondays, but today it's a Classic Trials Tuesday. So of course, if you guys are aware, I'm sure you are, the Karen Reed trial starts today. They are starting with jury selection. I've heard some things about them maybe needing a few days to pick a jury. So I wasn't planning on streaming the jury selection, even if they had cameras in the courtroom. I have no idea if they are going to have cameras in the courtroom, or if they have them. They probably have already started now. Anyway, so my plan was always to start after they have selected a jury. So this gives us an opportunity to have our classic trials this week, even with the Karen Reed trial starting up. So with that in mind, I wanted to get a move on with Dr. John Conte. We heard from him in the previous episode as well as the episode before. He is an expert in I can't remember specifically what it is, but he's an expert in child development and child psychology, and things like that. So we got through his full direct examination in the previous two episodes. And so now part 3, we are going to get into his cross-examination. Will Pam Bozanich be respectful of his credentials? Will she be a little bit derogatory towards him, claiming that he's like this junk scientist, right? Junk science, someone who does junk science. Anyway, which one of those will it be? Or maybe something in between. I don't know. We'll find out. We also are going to get into his redirect today. So we're going to finish with Dr. Conte today. And then we'll be moving on to the next witness in the next episode. So it was important to me to get through, to finish him up before we get into the Karen Reed trial, because I think during the Hannah Gutierrez Reed trial, we still had a witness on the stand for classic trials. And then we had to sort of shift gears and try to remember what they had testified before in the previous episode. And so I wanted to at least finish him off, and then get to the next witness after the Karen Reed trial. So, okay. I think that's everything that I needed to say. As always, if there are any audio issues, let me know as soon as possible so that I can fix them, or at least do what I can to fix them. And questions in the chat, let me know. I will either answer them right away or save them and answer them at a moment that is a little bit more convenient. Always trigger warnings with this trial. This is a tough trial. It's a very very difficult trial to sit through and watch. So if there's any point in time that you ever feel like you're having a hard time with it, do what you need to do for your mental health. That's all. And mods will probably put that in the chat along with mental health helplines from time to time. For example, this one. Thank you, Draco Amy. And we'll pull those up onto the screen from time to time, just to help folks out. Okay, let's get into it, shall we? Also, hey, go on, Indy Bear. Up. People want to see you. See? Oh, so cute. Good girl. Okay, now we're ready. Alrighty.
The jury involved solely with the defendant, Lyle Menendez, and Lyle Menendez's counsel are present as well as the prosecution. The witnesses on the witness stand State your name again for the record, please.
John Robert Conte, Conte.
All right. I'll remind you that you're still under oath.
Yes, sir.
Anything further for the defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. You may continue your direct examination then.
Thank you.
Oh, I guess we are
At this
finishing
time,
direct
I have
first.
A number of exhibits that I would like to mark. The backgammon box and its contents, which I'd like to mark as 311. A letter in Kitty Menendez's handwriting, which starts out, "Dear Jose, after 24 years," which I'd like marked as 312. A two-page letter written on yellow paper in Kitty Menendez's handwriting, which begins, "I realize I did not have any part," which I'd like to mark as 313. A 5-page letter on yellow legal tablet in Kitty Menendez's handwriting, marked, which begins, "Dear Jose, this letter is not easy to write," marked as 314. A Xerox copy of a handwritten letter dated Thursday, November 18th, 1987, which begins, "Well, Lester," which is in Kitty Menendez's handwriting, marked as 316. I'm sorry, I missed one. 315 should be an original handwritten 2-page letter in Kitty Menendez's handwriting, which begins, "It is 12:30. That would be 315. And the letter beginning, "Well, Lester," would be 316. May I approach the witness?
Yes.
Dr. Conte, I believe that you've read the testimony of Glenn Stevens regarding a request by Lyle Menendez, his girlfriend Jamie Pisarcik, to take a box out of his car at the time he was arrested. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And Glenn Stevens testified that he removed that box from Lyle Menendez's car and delivered it to Jerry Chaliff, who was the lawyer then representing him. Is that correct?
Yes.
And Lyle Menendez was asked about that box and its contents during his testimony and indicated that it was in the possession of the court. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yes.
I'm going to show you now the box, which we've marked as 311, the back end of the box, and ask you if you've had an opportunity to review its contents.
I have.
And I'm going to show you the letters which we've marked 312, 313, 314, 315, and 316, and ask you if you've had an opportunity to review those letters from Kitty Menendez.
Yes.
You've read them previously, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, was there anything that was in the box that had any effect on your opinion in this case?
Yes.
And what was that?
Well, I think, first of all, these letters are significant. They're really two sets. There are letters from Kitty to Jose, which reflect the kind of person she was. And I think what is reflected in those letters is consistent with other information I had about her as being self-absorbed, histrionic, overly emotional, dramatic, trying to present herself in the best light that she could. I think the note, I wouldn't really call it a letter, but the note to her therapist, when viewed in light of other information that the therapist has provided about this client, is significant in suggesting that this is an individual who's not really dealing with what I would consider deep psychological issues, but is rather dealing kind of superficially with her life.
I would just like that as being an improper opinion. This last part about the commentary in the letter to the therapist.
When you say this was a person, you're referring to whom?
Kitty.
The objection overruled. The answer was no.
Go ahead. In the letter, specifically the letter to Lester, who is her therapist, Dr. Summerfield. That letter is dated November 18th, 1987. Is that correct?
Yes,
And is it true that her hospitalization for a suicide attempt was just immediately prior to writing that letter?
that's my understanding.
And in that letter, does she reflect an alcohol problem?
Yes.
And what other emotional states are reflected in that letter? Or what other facts about Kitty are reflected in that letter?
Well, it's a little bit complicated. I'm sorry. You can sort of take, I think there's two sets of information that are important. One, if you look at the letter, she talks about drinking, talks about, although it's not, well, she talks some about Jose and being somewhat suspicious, but I think what is more significant is that this is a very superficial description of her life experiences to her psychotherapist. And so instead of dealing and making reference to things that she has talked about with her therapist that are of a significant or a deep psychological nature, this is sort of superficial comments about what's going on that evening. It would suggest, I think, a patient or a client who is not doing significant therapeutic work is dealing at a very superficial level.
Your Honor, I would move to strike everything after it suggests as being an improper opinion on the part of the witness, improper diagnosis.
Sustained as to that portion of the answer. The rest will remain.
With regard to the other letters, do they reflect are they consistent with the other information with regard to her suicidal state?
Yes, one of them, I don't think it's a letter, I would call it a note, which seems to be a suicide, somewhat disguised, but a suicide note.
Does she discuss in these letters her obsession with Louise, the girlfriend?
Yes,
And is that consistent with other information you had about her obsession in that regard?
yes, it is.
Now, was it your information that from her first visit to a therapist, she was talking about Louise and how could Jose do this to me? And the feelings of depression and pity, self-pity she felt as a result of that relationship.
Objection calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
Do you've reviewed her therapist notes both with Dr. Cox and Dr. Summerfield, is that correct?
That's correct.
And that covers the period from basically the end of 1986 up until right before Kitty Menendez's death?
Yes,
And is it true that she, from the very first to the very last session, never recovers from the sense of betrayal and anger she has about this relationship?
Objection, improper characterization calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
What is your opinion with regard to what improvement, if any, she made in that area in terms of getting over the relationship?
Objection, improper opinion.
Sustained.
Do the letters reflect the same information you have with regard to the contents of the therapy notes and her obsession with Louise?
yes.
Do the letters contain anything else of significance to you with regard to her or her relationship with her family?
I think there are references to her kids and what she's given the kids and comparing, talks about in one of them feeding Erik when he comes home. They're sort of consistent with other information that suggests that this is a person for whom impression and socially appropriate behavior is important. They don't, in my reading of them, in light of all of the other information I have about her, they don't ring to be very truthful statements about her.
Objection, move to strike everything that they don't ring to be truthful. Improper opinion.
Sustained. That portion of the answer is stricken.
Do you feel that you indicated that that the letters are consistent in that she had a need to be viewed as something other than she was?
Yes,
And what did you mean by that?
Objection, improper opinion.
Sustained.
she indicated in one of the letters that she had given her boys whatever values she could to help them succeed in life. Is that
Yes.
true? Does she express any deep love for them or concern what her suicide would do?
Objection, improper opinion. Let us get the results.
Are you asking, was there anything written with those words?
Based on, maybe I can rephrase the question if I might, Your Honor. Based on your reading of the letters, do you get the sense that this is a woman who is deeply attached to her children?
Objection, improper opinion.
Sustained.
In evaluating the letters, did you attempt to discern at what point in time they were written?
Yes.
And did you have the information that she discovered the affair toward the end of the summer of 1986?
Yes.
And are there references in the letter to how long she has been suffering with that information?
Yes.
And what did that enable you to get a sense of when these letters were written?
Yes.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Cross-examination?
Okay, here's Cross.
Dr. Conte, you have a doctorate in social work, correct?
Correct.
And as part of your social work, you treat families, is that correct?
I treat individuals. I don't really do family work.
Have you ever treated someone who was suffering from depression as a result of an extramarital affair?
I've treated adults for depression and extramarital and other kinds of problems have been associated with the depression. I wouldn't say that that was the only reason they were depressed.
After reading the letters, first of all,
That was an interesting pause. He definitely took a while to answer, which I mean, generally speaking, his testimony has struck me as somebody who is who wants to be thoughtful and careful with how he responds to things overall. So like that's not necessarily inconsistent, but that definitely was a long pause that he needed to kind of sit back and think about what he was going to say before he said it.
first of all, may I approach, please, Your Honor?
Yes.
The letters which have been marked as 312 to 315, to your knowledge, they came from this box, is that correct?
Yes.
And the letter which is 316, which is to Lester, which appears to be the therapist, which I think is over to your left. Do you have any knowledge of where this letter came from?
I believe it came from the box, but
But you have no personal knowledge of
No.
it, is that correct? All right. And in reading these letters of this woman, did you feel any compassion for her?
yeah,
Okay, and you know in the letters, in at least one or two of them, she expresses love for her children, is that correct?
yes.
Right. Would that be inconsistent with your view that she didn't love them?
Would these, I'm sorry, I'm confused. Her statement be
Yeah,
inconsistent?
her statements in these letters, which are some of them to her husband, and which she indicates that she loves her sons and has tried to give them her values. Was that consistent with a woman who loved her children?
I don't believe she loved her children.
And in spite of the letters that you've read, exhibits 312 through 315, you still have that opinion, is that correct?
I think her entire history would suggest to the contrary.
But you never talked to Kitty Menendez.
That's correct.
Now, you have a PhD in social work. When you were in an undergraduate in college, how many psychology courses did you take?
As an undergraduate,
Yes.
I'm so, maybe two, but that's so long ago, I have no idea.
All right. And you got a master's in social work, correct?
That's correct.
And did you take any psychology courses in order to get your master's degree?
I don't recall specifically. I think it's a common area of confusion, so maybe I can try to explain it. It depends on what you mean by psychology. There's a big piece, psychology, which refers to a profession, which is learned in graduate schools of psychology and departments of psychology. There's also a small p psychology, which really means the study of mental processes and behavior in humans and in animals. And the small p psychological content was in fact one of the bases for much of my training as a master's social worker.
Did you ever take anything like abnormal psychology or childhood psychology courses?
Well, in the small p sense of psychological content, there was abnormal psychological content, both with kids and adults, as part of the curriculum of the School of Social Work, yes.
And that was for your master's?
Yes,
And your doctorate, you wrote a dissertation, didn't you?
yes.
And what was the subject matter of your doctoral dissertation?
The terribly interesting research issue that had to do with what was the best way to study human behavior? What kind of observation produced the greatest impact on a subject's behavior, whether it was a human observer or a video camera? It was a methodological dissertation. One of the things we do in doctoral programs is to teach people how to use research methods to develop new knowledge and to critically analyze existing knowledge. So a methodological dissertation is one way that we prepare doctoral students to be able to develop knowledge and to consume knowledge.
Your doctoral dissertation was not in the area of child abuse, was it?
No.
And it was not in the area of interpersonal violence, is that correct?
That's correct. In fact, at that time, which was, I got my PhD in 1979, child abuse was just an emerging field. I doubt that there were very many dissertations anywhere in the country that had to do with child abuse.
Now, you are not a licensed psychologist in the state of Washington, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you are not a psychiatrist, correct?
That's correct.
Nor a medical doctor, correct?
That's correct.
And what is there licensing for social workers in the state of Washington? In other words, do you have to be licensed by the
No,
state?
in the state of Washington, social workers are registered as counselors.
And what do you have to do in order to become registered?
You have to have a master's degree in one of the mental health fields like social work or educational psychology. You have to take a health course on AIDS and pay a fee.
And pay a fee?
Pay a fee, yeah.
All right. And there's no testing by the state of Washington to enable you to be licensed as a social worker, correct?
No, states vary. Most states in the United States do not license social workers. Some few do.
But Washington does license psychologists, doesn't it?
It does.
Now, how many hours would you say you've spent on this case? How many hours have you spent preparing or
My
testifying?
brother. Sometime last week, I figured it was well over 500.
500 hours?
Yes.
And how are you being compensated?
It's always a question that
I
comes
was
up.
paid $100 an hour for about 70 hours of work in 1992, which I calculate to be about $12 or $13 an hour for all of my work.
So the total amount of your compensation then is what you were paid in 1992?
Yes,
And you do not expect to be paid for your testimony here in court?
that's correct.
Now, you indicated that when you got your doctorate in 1979, that child abuse was emerging as a field. Is that correct?
Correct.
And would you say that in the last 10 years that it has been a burgeoning field with lots of writings being created in the psychology and social work field?
And psychiatry and psychosocial nursing and sociology, yes. And
So it's actually a booming area of abuse. The child abuse is a booming area. Would you say that?
I don't know what you mean by a booming area. There's been dramatic increases in knowledge and in public awareness about the problem, yes.
And as a result of that, many, many more people now in 1993 write in the topics of child abuse and family abuse than wrote about it in, let's say, 1980. Wouldn't you say that's true?
Yes,
And I believe you indicated that you are the editor of a journal. Is it the Interpersonal Violence?
the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, yes.
And are there other journals that deal with the same topics that you're familiar with?
Yes, there are some specialized journals that deal only with child abuse, and then there are some journals which deal with interpersonal violence, and then there are many social work, psychological, psychiatric, nursing, sociology, other journals which may publish from time to time articles about various aspects of child abuse.
When did you first testify in a courtroom in the area of child abuse? What year was it?
Not absolutely sure, but I would imagine 88 or 89 perhaps, but that's just a wild guess. I don't recall specifically.
And since 88 or 89, when you first testified about child abuse in a courtroom, how many times have you testified about child abuse?
Well, it would depend on what aspect of child abuse. All testimony, boy, it's just a rough guess, 20 times, 25 times maybe.
Do you find that
So what she's getting at is how qualified is this guy really to talk about child abuse? You know, he has all this experience and whatnot, but how much of that actually applies to what he's testifying to and the way that he's presenting himself as an expert to the jury? That's what she's getting at. But you know, 20 out of 80 times, a quarter of the time, I don't know. I'd say that's probably a decent amount. And I mean, the fact that he's testified 80 times as an expert. And 20 times as an expert talking about child abuse. Yeah, I mean, I'd say that's probably enough, at least for my opinion.
as the years go by that you're testifying more per year since 1988?
Maybe a little bit, but most of the forensic work I do doesn't really end up. It's a rare occurrence to go to court.
Could you please tell the jury what forensic work is?
Forensic work is mental health study and evaluation and diagnosis that is done for the purpose of some legal proceedings such as this, or sometimes there are other kinds of issues.
Now, with the emergence of child abuse as a topic that has a lot of interest, are you also aware of the fact that there are many television shows which deal with specific people who claim that they have been abused and give specific accounts?
Yes.
You're familiar with that phenomena?
Yes.
And you're familiar with shows like Phil Donahue and Oprah Winfrey and Sally Jesse Raphael?
Yes, I've been on 2 of the 3 myself.
All right, so it's so have you testified about child abuse, or not testified, but have you told the audience about child abuse on those kinds of shows?
Yes.
Now, have you ever testified before in such a manner as in this case? In other words, on behalf of defendants charged with a criminal offense where there is a claim of child abuse?
Yes.
How many times have you done that?
Four.
4 other times aside from this time, is that
Yes.
correct? And you were paid for your testimony, or you were paid for your work in those cases, correct?
Regrettably, not always, no.
All right.
One case, which is probably the longest case I've been involved in because of various appeals. I've now been involved 4 years, and that case is totally pro bono.
That means for free, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But the other cases you were paid, is that correct?
Yes.
You're aware of the fact that there's a great deal of literature in the field of interpersonal violence and child abuse, which has specific accountings of specific things that happen to people, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, when was it you were first approached in this case to become involved? What month and what year?
January, toward the end of January 1992.
And when did you first see Joseph Lyle Menendez?
I'm not absolutely sure. I think it was March or April.
Of that same year?
Yes.
Okay, now when you went to visit him at the jail, did you ever sign visitor slips so that you could obtain access to him in the jail?
No.
Were you in the company of anyone else when you went to see him in the jail?
No.
All right. Did you ever ask to see any records that the jail might have of other people who'd been to see him prior to you going to see him in March of 1992?
No.
Okay. You made no inquiry as to whether or not he'd seen any other psychotherapists, for instance?
No.
Were you interested in perhaps whether or not he'd seen any other psychotherapists?
I knew that he had seen people.
Are we getting into Dr. Oziel again? Can we please talk about Dr. Oziel again?
Prior to me and had had visitors. I wasn't particularly interested in the content of those visits. No.
Were you at all concerned with contamination of him? In other words, were you at all concerned that perhaps he had received information which might be fed to you?
Absolutely.
Now, you were here during the testimony of Dr. Burgess, is that correct? When she testified about the neurobiological effects of fear and stress?
Yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with the research that's being done in that area?
Very little. It's not an area of expertise. I have some knowledge about some aspects of that literature that have to do with the hyperarousal, physiological arousal in victims of trauma and stress, but I'm not an expert on the neurobiological explanations for that hyperarousal, and certainly not on human anatomy.
All right. So you have no opinion as to whether or not this particular defendant, Lyle Menendez, suffered from that fear response described by Dr. Burgess in her testimony to this jury. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you have no way of knowing why it is both he and his brother would have the same response on August the 20th, 1989. In other words, if there was a biological response in each of them, you have no way of knowing why or how they would each have exactly the identical response. Was that correct?
The identical biological response?
Yeah, if in fact they had this biological response, you have no way of knowing how they would have arrived at having the identical biological response. Is that correct?
Well, it's an interesting question. No, I don't.
Okay. In your studies and in your research in the area of child abuse, and I'm using child abuse generically as including all three types, do you have an opinion as to whether or not child abuse victims can hate their abusers?
I think it depends. It's a complicated question, and it's an interesting one. Depends what you mean by hatred, and it probably varies depending on whether you're talking about intra-family or extra-family.
Okay, let's deal with intra-family child abuse, where the parents or the caregivers are the alleged perpetrators of the abuse.
I think it is possible, primarily in adult survivors, over time to come to what they describe as hatred, although it's rarely a single emotion, because when the victim and the offender have an ongoing relationship or had a relationship, especially a parent-child relationship, those are incredibly complex relationships, and they may have many feelings at the same time. There's certainly, and so it depends a little bit what we mean by anger, but certainly there is, I have seen in adult survivors considerable anger at things that were done to them. At the same time that they may also have many positive feelings that are part of that same emotion. So that in families, often the feelings become very entwined. And one of the things we do in therapy over time is to try to help separate those emotions so that the client understands better the range of affects that were caused by child abuse.
Is it possible for a child abuse victim to hate their parents without even knowing that they really were feeling hatred? And an internalized feeling of hatred.
It's possible for all human beings to have feelings which they are not consciously aware of, and I don't see any reason why that would not be true of child abuse victims.
Is there anything about being a child abuse victim that precludes one from planning a murder?
No.
Okay. Now, abuse causes effects in the abuse victim, correct?
It can, yes.
All right. And would it be fair to say that there are no set series of symptoms that would indicate that a child has been abused?
That's correct.
Okay. Because because the abuse can be so variable, the child can be so variable, that there's not one set standard group of symptoms where you can say, I see these symptoms, that child must have been abused. Correct?
That's correct.
All right. Would it be fair to say, though, that in many abuse cases, the child is crippled emotionally or in their dealings in everyday life? In other words, the child is not capable of conducting normal activities. Is that one thing that you have seen in child abuse victims?
Well, no. I mean, what I think we tend to see, it's a little bit complicated, and I apologize. I'll try to do as quickly as I can. I think what we see is a wide range of effects. It is a very rare victim who is, to use your term, so crippled that they can't function. Most victims of child abuse have jobs and families, and they may have really very significant impacts of the abuse, but still sort of manage their daily lives. It depends to some extent, I think, on how crippling those effects are. I mean, for example, some victims drink, and they drink to excess and they're unable to function. Others drink only in the evening and still manage jobs. So the effects of abuse can be profound. They can affect every area of life, and yet a person can still go along and function, and people who would see them wouldn't know how damaged they are by those effects, either because they're able to manage them or cope them, or they hide them.
Okay. Did you hear the testimony of Dr. Hart when he testified in front of this jury?
Most of it, I believe, yes.
All right. Are you aware that he classified the psychological abuse to Lyle Menendez in terms of mild to severe?
Yes,
And are you in agreement with his classification that this is a severe case of psychological abuse?
yes.
All right. Now, in your practice as a social worker and also as a researcher, have you seen more severe cases of abuse than this one?
Psychological?
Well, let me back up.
Okay.
Physical abuse has psychological components, correct?
Yes,
So that if a child is locked in a closet and fed nothing but gruel for a period of 4 or 5 years, that has a psychological as well as a physical effect on the child.
yes,
And if a child is raised in a home with a foot of garbage on the ground and is not nourished correctly, that has a psychological effect on the child as well.
yes.
All right. Would you consider those to be serious or severe cases of child abuse, where children are locked in closet for years on end?
I would consider those to be quite severe.
All right. And in terms of those particular kinds of cases, which have you seen those kinds of cases personally or just read about them?
I've seen them.
And you've seen cases where a baby or a toddler will be brought to you and has open sores from living among garbage, correct?
I have not seen those because I don't treat infants, but I've been in case consultations where cases like that have been presented.
Would you classify those kinds of cases as more severe than this one?
Well, it depends on what we have to sort of, we're talking about severity in terms of the abuse, not the impact. Those are certainly, I mean, the infliction of, bodily wounds, for example, is quite severe. It's hard to sort of measure severity when you're talking about the abuse without also looking at the effect. If you ask me only to look at the infliction of physical damage, for example, on the infant you described, then the abuse that, for example, Lyle was exposed to, although there was physical injury and damage, for example, when he was hit in the lip, I don't think that the physical abuse goes to that same level as that hypothetical infant you described.
You talked about the effect of the abuse versus the abuse. The effect of the abuse is what happens to the person who's abused, correct?
Right.
And the only way you can judge the effect of the abuse is to talk to the abuse victim. I mean, ultimately, isn't that what you're concerned with?
In part, although you also talk to other people who know that individual.
And to see how that individual has behaved, correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, in this particular case, did you consider any of the records of Dr. Oziel in your evaluation of Lyle Menendez?
I read them, but I didn't consider them.
Why not?
I don't consider that to be a very credible source of information.
Did you rely on the records of Mrs. Menendez from Dr. Summerfield?
Yes.
And did you make any effort to talk to Dr. Summerfield?
Yes.
Okay. Now, have you ever been threatened with death or great bodily injury by one of your patients?
Never by death, but injury.
Have you ever feared for your life as a result of a consultation with one of your clients?
No.
Now, you received information in this case from, in order to make your evaluation, correct? In other words, someone gave you information so that you could read it.
Yes.
And who gave you the information?
Well, there were different, probably is the easiest way to answer, say there were different sets. There was some material that was provided by the defense. There was some material that I obtained by interviewing informants directly myself.
And who provided you with the interviews, the written interviews?
The defense interviews?
Yes.
The defense, Mrs. Lansing.
And who provided you with the prosecution interviews?
Mrs. Lansing.
Okay, did you get any information from the prosecution directly in this case?
No, I was never contacted by the prosecution.
And you never contacted the prosecution either?
Well, I've been involved in a number of other cases, and normally what happens is once your name is released, opposing counsel contacts you. I've been in this court 5 days before I started testifying and had a pleasant conversation with your co-counsel, but at no point did anyone come up to provide me any additional information.
And you also understand that until you take the stand, the information you have about this case is privileged, correct?
No, that's not my understanding. My understanding is that once my name is released, the opposing counsel always is able to come up, and I've been involved in cases where opposing counsel has come up and said, do you know X, Y, or Z, or have asked about testimony. I think it's, once the name is released, my understanding is that there is in fact no privilege.
Well, if you were wrong about that, would that change your opinion? In other words,
My opinion about what?
well, do you understand you're not allowed to divulge your findings to the prosecution until you take the witness stand?
That is not my understanding.
All right. Now, did you find any medical findings of battered child syndrome to this defendant?
Yes.
And what would you say those are? Are you talking about the scars that you previously testified to?
Yes.
Did you find any indication of things like spiral fractures?
No.
Okay, would you indicate to the jury what a spiral fracture is?
A spiral, it's a bone fracture. It's a slight injury to the bone that is appears on X-ray.
And it's traditionally
But like, what I want to know is, does it show up years later after it's healed? That's what I would like to know.
associated with physical child abuse, correct?
It's associated with some kinds of physical child abuse, yes.
Okay.
Soft tissue damage is more likely to result from physical abuse.
Okay, but you found no indication that there was any kind of spiral fractures or any kind of fractures at all in this case. Is that correct?
I didn't see any X-ray reports in the medical records.
And the battered child syndrome is a physical diagnosis, is it not?
That's not correct. The battered child syndrome that was first coined by Dr. Kemp described primarily physical, especially signs that would appear on X-rays. Since Dr. Kemp's original work, which was really responsible for sort of capturing public attention about it, the battered child syndrome has come to include both physical impacts or symptoms and psychological. The battered child syndrome or diagnosis has tended to be used in the law more in terms of physical symptoms because it's useful in prosecuting a parent for child abuse. But it's, I think, pretty clear in the literature that psychological impacts or effects are also part of the syndrome.
Correct, but it's not a purely psychological syndrome, is it? It was a syndrome that was born out of physical diagnosis.
It was born out of physical diagnosis, yeah.
I think one of the things you said on your direct examination is something that you found significant about this family was the fact that they were secretive. Is that correct?
Secretive, yes.
Yes. Did you find it all interesting that
I like how he corrected her on her pronunciation of secretive. That was because I remember last time, or maybe, I don't know, at some point in this trial, I think that it was Pam's pronunciation of secretive when she said secretive, that people in the chat got a little like grossed out by it, understandably. But that was just funny how he was like, you mean secretive? Yeah.
that they sent their sons to a psychotherapist if in fact they were secret keepers?
No,
That didn't in any way affect your opinion, is that correct?
that happens quite often. I mean,
Okay, well, in this particular case, my question is the fact that they sent their sons to psychologists, does that contravene your opinion that they were secret keepers?
no, it's
All right.
consistent.
Now, the fact that there were so many people who came in to testify in this case about specific instances of abuse that they saw, for, like tennis coaches and people like that, that would show a lack of secrecy if these things were done in public, correct?
Well, it could be a lack of secrecy or an inability to control oneself so that some signs and symptoms of abuse tend to creep out over the years.
Well, would you consider the number of people who came and testified in this case to be just a symptom of creeping out? Or would you consider that these things were done out in the open? In other words, the behavior at the tennis tournaments, the behavior at the country club.
Well,
It's an interesting point that she's making there, right? Because she's saying, like, look, everything that they did wrong happened out in public. Nothing else happened behind closed doors. But I don't believe that. But it's an interesting argument that she's making.
what behavior you're talking about. I don't think that people have testified. There's been testimony that I have seen and read that seems to present the tip of an iceberg of child abuse. And certainly there is testimony that the pathology of this family has been present to many other people. The most serious instances of abuse have not been revealed beyond the family's doors, at least as far as I can tell.
I think you indicated one of the things you found compelling about the information you received in this case was the corroboration by Diane Vandermolen, the cousin of Lyle Menendez.
Yes.
Okay. Did you read her testimony in front of this jury?
I read it and I viewed some parts of it, yes.
All right. Were you aware of the fact that she didn't divulge the information about the complaint of having been touched in the genitals by Lyle Menendez until her second interview with the defense attorneys?
Yes.
And are you aware of the fact that that occurred after she had been to visit her cousin Lyle in custody on 3 separate occasions?
Yes.
Did that cause you any suspicion of the genesis of that information?
Well, I'm always suspicious in a case like this, but I found her to be quite credible. The visits that you described, my understanding is that on at least one of them, Lyle's grandmother was also present. They were not the kind of interviews I had that were behind closed doors at the jail, but rather were in a somewhat public visitation setting. I mean, there were people next to her. She was talking, I understand, through glass. So I certainly considered it, and I always worry about it. But her descriptions to me over the 2 times I saw her in almost 8 hours, I think were credible.
Okay. Now, you're aware of the fact that Lyle Menendez has privileges in the county jail to use the telephone to make outgoing phone calls.
Yes.
Okay. Have you ever had one of those phone calls from him?
I've had calls. I don't think we've ever actually talked. We may have talked once.
But you are aware of the fact that he can make phone calls
Yes.
in the county jail.
Yes.
And has extensive phone privileges. Are you aware of that?
I know he has phone privileges. I don't know what extensive means.
I believe you indicated that secrecy, and I just asked you this, that secrecy was somehow consistent with your opinion about this. Were you aware of the fact that the Menendezes had house guests sometimes for a year at a time?
Yes.
All right. Did you consider that to be the kind of behavior consistent with people who keep secrets, to have house guests?
Yes. I think the critical thing is that and there were house guests that have testified here. The critical thing is that when Jose was with his boys, for example, the house guests were not to venture down into that part of the house. When Jose and Lyle were having an extended conversation at a Thanksgiving, no member of the extended family felt comfortable in going down and saying, hey, let's go up and have Thanksgiving dinner. So the presence of house guests and other family members doesn't deny that this was a secret family and that it was a family that made efforts to keep certain interactions between the child and the father secret.
Do you consider it a good parenting method to humiliate or discipline a child in front of others?
No.
Okay, so would you consider it, if in fact Jose Menendez was disciplining his child in private, would you consider that to be a better method of discipline than to discipline him in front of his cousins or his siblings?
If in fact that's what was happening, I
Well,
would consider that.
if in
Yes.
fact that was what happening, that would have been good parenting versus bad parenting, right?
Yes. That's what I just said.
Right. Now, I believe you indicated that you found it significant that when he was 15 and a half years old that Lyle Menendez had this sexual interlude with his cousin Diane.
Yes.
Okay. So do you find it unusual for a 15 and a half year old boy to be curious about sex?
No.
Okay. Is that something that's fairly normal for a 15 and a half year old boy to be curious about sex?
I assume so, yes.
Now, were you aware of testimony from a woman named Alicia Hertz about a movie that was shown in the Menendez home called Pixote?
Yes.
Are you aware of the contents of that movie?
I've heard it described as sexually explicit, but I'm not aware. I've not viewed the videotape.
All right. Are you aware of the fact that it deals with children growing up in the slums of Brazil?
Yes.
Okay. And are you aware that children who grow up in the slums of Brazil have a tough time?
Yes.
All right. But you've never personally seen the movie to decide in your own mind whether or not it's pornographic or documentary.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, in analyzing Lyle Menendez, did you ever consider the possibility of that he might have some traits of antisocial personality disorder?
Yes,
And did you reject that notion?
I did.
Are you aware of the fact that Lyle Menendez asked his former girlfriend, Jamie Pizarczyk, to come to court for a fee and to lie about something that had happened with his father?
I'm aware of that incident. I was not aware of all of the elements that you just described, but essentially I was aware of that incident, yes.
Would you consider that to be consistent or inconsistent with an antisocial personality, that someone would try to suborn perjury?
Well, it would certainly be consistent with an antisocial personality diagnosis, although Lyle's actual statements to Jamie that appear to indicate that he was getting bad advice from someone and he knew that she wasn't going to do it would be inconsistent with such a diagnosis.
But he still asked her, didn't he?
He did.
And you're aware of the fact that he admitted that he asked her in this courtroom.
Yes.
Okay. Now, would you consider lying about the murder to be consistent with having an antisocial personality?
Well, I would consider lying to be consistent, thank you, with antisocial personality tendencies.
But in spite of this incident with Jamie, in spite of the lies, you rejected the idea of antisocial personality disorder, or at least traits of it.
There could also be a bunch of other reasons why somebody lies in their defense to the police about something bad that they did. That doesn't automatically mean that you have any kind of a disorder. Anyway.
Yes.
Correct?
But there are a host of reasons for that rejection.
Right. I just asked you if, in fact, you did or didn't. I believe you indicated that you found his detailed descriptions important, correct? In deciding whether or not the sexual abuse had occurred?
I think that detail can be, as I suggested, can be a variable that is helpful in knowing whether sexual abuse took place. It's not the only factor, but it can be.
For instance, if you're interviewing a 3-year-old child who claims to have been sexually abused by a man, and the 3-year-old child can describe how semen looks, you consider that to be pretty revealing that the child has personal knowledge, wouldn't you say?
Well, generally, yes. Although, again, as I indicated, one has to be very careful when one takes a single factor like that,
Yeah,
because it is
makes sense.
conceivable that a 3-year-old child could have things told to her that might make it possible for her to take a description of semen, for example, and make it quite believable. And so what one has to be careful not to do is to take any one element out, raise it up and say, this is diagnostic, but rather one looks at the total pattern of factors, how they are presented, and then an assessment about credibility can be made.
He's a
But
good
if a
expert
3-year-old
witness.
can describe
my
semen
opinion.
for you versus, like, say, a 12-year-old boy describing semen for you, it would be much more compelling in the 3-year-old than in the 12-year-old at first blush, correct?
Well, again, with all the cautions I said, that one does not take a single factor out. Yes.
All right. Did you consider in this particular case that at the time that you spoke to Lyle Menendez, he was approximately 23 years old?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the concept of suggestibility as it relates to child abuse victims?
Yes.
Could you describe to the jury what suggestibility is?
Sure. Suggestibility is a concept that we use to communicate the idea that kids, by either direct influence, like someone telling them what to say, or by poor interviewing, such as by very leading questions or questions that suggest the answer. Suggestibility in children describes the notion that kids may be led to making statements that sound like abuse when they didn't really have the experience. And there's been quite a bit of research on kids of various ages, and also of adults for that matter, that indicates that all human observers can be manipulated or led to make statements which turn out not to be 100% accurate. Little kids, I don't know whether you want me to go into the specific research on little kids, but
No, the general notion of suggestibility is that people can be led to make claims of child abuse when they weren't in fact abused.
that's correct.
And it's not just a question of degree, it's a question of saying, I was abused when in fact they weren't abused, correct?
Is the question, is it possible to get someone to say they were abused when they weren't through some kind of suggestive or coercive process?
Yes, that's my question.
Yes.
All right. And in fact, the research bears out that that process can occur, correct?
Well, no, actually the research bears out that all human observers can be led to be making statements that are false. The research suggests that in many ways, little kids are less suggestible than our older people. There is no research that I know of, if I can say categorically, there is no research which suggests that kids can be made to make false reports of sexual abuse. The research has looked at sex suggestibility about other types of events, obviously, because there'd be no way to lead a kid to abuse and abuse them and check it out. So I didn't say that very
You
clearly.
can't, well, what you're saying is you can't do a research project with children where you try to lead them to believe they were sexually abused and then test their responses, because that would be unethical.
That's what I was trying to say, but you said it better.
All right, thank you. Now, I think you indicated then that older people are more open to suggestibility than younger children, correct?
Well, adults make different kinds. Adults are more likely to be led to saying things that happened that didn't happen. Kids are more likely to leave out information.
And adults have motivators that children don't have, correct?
Yeah, I think the older you become, the more complicated your motivations become.
Would you consider being incarcerated on a capital offense to be a motivator to be open to suggestibility?
Certainly, although I don't know whether that's really the concept we're talking about. I don't think suggestibility is not synonymous with saying things are not true. I think that generally in a legal case, especially a criminal case, we don't worry about suggestibility as much as we worry about outright fabrication. And therefore, that's why part of a forensic assessment is an attempt to determine whether or not an individual has fabricated what they're telling you. So I think it probably serves our purposes if we separate suggestibility and fabrication.
Right, because
So yeah, Tish, good question here. Is he talking about making false claims or having false memories? So he's talking about false memories, but the question that was asked was more kind of blending false memories with false claims, basically saying, can someone, being on trial for capital murder, have enough motivation to open themselves up to suggestibility? She's definitely like just blending the two concepts there. But what he's saying is that suggestibility is a thing. Having a reason to make something up entirely on your own is something different, because suggestibility means that you actually believe it, that you believe this thing happened, but it didn't actually happen because you've been convinced by someone else. But making up a false claim is knowing that it's false and using that as if it's the truth for your own purposes. Also, let me get a couple questions here that we got earlier. Lunar 35 questions. Is it expected for experts to reach out to both sides? Not particularly, no. I mean, when it comes to, getting a fully accurate picture, like you want your expert to examine as much information as possible to include both sides, because you want them to be as prepared as possible to testify, and you want them to have considered all perspectives before they've gotten to the point that they're sitting on the jury. But if there are reasons why he would have decided not to look at a particular witness, not to look, go down a certain path, like they also are not expected to go down every single possible path ever, right? I mean, similar to the way in which, in a criminal case, police investigation isn't required to look at every possible lead. Like if they determine, okay, that's not so likely, like that doesn't seem like that would be likely, or it just doesn't make sense. Like they can have that kind of discretion as well. Olivia says, is there some type of time limit for cross-examination? For civil cases, it depends on the court. For civil cases, I would say there's more of an emphasis on time because, you've got two sides that are spending a lot of money on these cases. Here we're talking about liberty and justice and things like that are the ultimate things that we are trying for. So there's less of an emphasis on on how much time each side has and are they using up all their minutes. Generally speaking, that's what I've noticed. There might be some courts that are not like that, but that's just been my observation. Alrighty, moving on down.
Suggestibility indicates sort of an unconscious suggestion on the part of the interviewer, where fabrication would be just a conscious attempt to make something up.
Yes.
There is a distinction, right?
Yes, although I think it has more to do, not so much with the interviewer, but with the person whose testimony we're concerned about. Suggestibility would suggest that a person could unconsciously, perhaps without full awareness, be led to make certain statements and perhaps to believe them. Fabrication is a process whereby the person accused of the crime may make statements that are not true for their own reasons, having nothing to do with the interviewer. And so the task of the interviewer is to try to assess whether or not these tales are fabricated or not.
Now, do you think you can be fooled?
Yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with the concept of malingering as it's defined in the DSM-3R?
Yes.
And you're familiar with the fact that an interviewer should be considering malingering when there are factors such as incarceration at work in the interviewee, correct?
That's correct, although the cautions for the examiner to be aware of malingering really have to do with a person who fabricates or exaggerates psychological or psychiatric symptoms, not stories about the crime. Indeed, Meyerson, in the comprehensive textbook of psychiatry in the 5th edition, in the only chapter in that book on malingering, alerts the physician to the danger of overdiagnosis of malingering in forensic cases. But it's again linked specifically to the fabrication or exaggeration about symptomatology, not the ultimate question.
Would you agree that in this particular case, the issue of child abuse and the issue of the events of the week of August the 15th through the 20th are two separate things? In other words, in your evaluation of Lyle Menendez, did you consider that he might be lying about the events of August the 20th and might not be lying about the events of his childhood?
Yes.
Okay. And did you consider the fact that if in fact all these events of abuse were true, that would provide a motive to hate your father?
Say it again.
If all of the events that Lyle Menendez and his cousins and coaches and aunts and uncles testified to were true, did you consider that would be a motivator for him to hate his father?
Well, I did more than
The way that she just phrased that with like the cousins and aunts and uncles and everything was, I wouldn't do that if I were the prosecution, because it definitely seems like, oh, there's all this overwhelming evidence of the abuse happening in their childhood. But I mean, her overall point here is that creates a reason for them to hate their parents, and that's why they killed them.
consider it. I considered it. I looked for indications of it, and I couldn't find it.
But if he had told you that he hated his father, that would certainly support the prosecution's theory that this was a crime that was born out of hatred. Correct?
Absolutely, but I looked for much more subtle indications of hatred than simply a statement like that.
Do you know what he was doing in county jail for the 2 years before you saw him?
No.
Do you know what he was reading in the county jail for the 2 years before you saw him?
No.
Now, I believe you indicated that this is a case of classic sexual abuse. Is that correct?
I don't believe so, no.
Well, would you consider the things that you heard about from Lyle Menendez and the symptomology that you heard about to be somewhat typical of child sexual abuse cases? In other words, the grooming process. I think you testified about the
Yes.
grooming process. There was nothing unique about this grooming process, correct?
Correct.
And there was nothing unique about the particular details that you heard, correct?
Correct.
And there was nothing unique about, for instance, bedwetting, if in fact the bedwetting was caused by the child abuse, and I'm using that generically, correct?
Correct.
So was there anything about Lyle Menendez's case of generic child abuse that was unique to you?
Well, it's such a broad question. We started out talking about sexual abuse, and now we've expanded to child abuse.
All right, let me
okay.
rephrase it then. In terms of the sexual abuse, was there anything that you heard about the sexual abuse that was unique?
Yes.
And what would you classify as being unique?
Lyle's statement that the abuse stopped when he was a young boy.
And you found that to be unique?
I find it surprising, given all of the other factors in the case. Everything I know about his father, I found it surprising.
Now, in your view, why do child molesters like to have sex with children?
That is a complicated, multi-layered question. There are different motivations, it appears. There is some research that suggests that some child molesters are sexually aroused to having sex with children. There is less research, but there are clinical ideas that some child molesters have sex with children because they meet other psychological needs, such as the need to control or dominate or humiliate. And there may be some combination of physiological arousal and meeting psychological needs.
And those particular factors you've just talked about are things that a child possesses. In other words, it's the fact that the person that the child molester is having sex with is a child that fulfills the needs, be it psychological or sexual, correct?
Yes.
And once that child becomes an adult, then those particular features are gone, correct?
Correct.
Okay. In your experience or in your research, how often have you seen child molesters who were also heterosexual and homosexual?
Oh, quite often. The current trend in the literature on sex offenders is to suggest that sex offenders are polyperverse, meaning they engage in more than one type of sexually deviant act. Probably the best data we have are from studies by Dr. Gene Abel in Atlanta, Dr. Judith Becker in Arizona, and their colleagues, which suggests, for example, that about half of incest fathers and stepfathers are abusing children outside of the home at the same time as those stepfathers or fathers are abusing their own children. About 18% of incest fathers or stepfathers are raping adult women at the same time as they're having sex with their own children. So the old notion that people tend to do just one deviant act, in the last decade or so, we've come to recognize of this polyperversity, that people who have problems with sex tend to exhibit in lots of different ways.
That answer was not one that she was looking for, because what she's been saying is like, well, he couldn't have abused his kids because he had affairs on his wife, with other women, and therefore he was straight. And so that's an important point that he's making here that goes against what the prosecution said as to the evidence as to whether or not Jose Menendez abused his sons.
Did you find in Lyle Menendez's childhood medical records any physical symptoms of child sexual abuse?
No.
None.
No, but you don't really expect to find them. The best data we have currently available suggests that sexually abused children, only about 25% of cases are going to have clear positive findings of sexual abuse.
Now,
So
if you had found, I'm sorry.
no. So that medical findings are rarely diagnostic of abuse. It's great when you've got tears or a sexually transmitted disease or something, it makes it much easier to prosecute those cases. The absence of medical findings is not diagnostic that abuse didn't take place.
But the presence of them is diagnostic, correct?
Well, it's certainly suggestive. Again, there can be other ways that tears can take place, so that you really need a physician with expertise, for example, in the gynecological examination of young children, to help us understand whether or not those injuries could only be caused, or in the case of males, for example, anal scars and other injuries that could only be caused by penetration. So I'm sorry. Go ahead, I'm done.
Are you done?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any figures as to the percentage of the population in the United States that has been victimized by sexual abuse as children?
Estimates vary dramatically from study to study. Some studies, and the reason they vary, we think, is because of methodological reasons. For example, if you ask people over the telephone, we think we get a lower rate. So it's very difficult to say. Upwards, maybe 1 out of 4 women, maybe 1 out of 5 men, but the estimates vary so much that I personally think that it's probably better just to recognize that it happens to lots of people, and that we don't have the actual studies yet on the entire U.S. population, or we don't have enough studies that have used the same methodology to have a real reliable estimate.
Do you personally believe that child abuse should excuse criminal conduct?
What a question.
Do I personally? I don't know what my personal feelings are. I recognize that from my own work with clients and from my reading of the literature, that child abuse can be associated with many problems, criminal behavior and other kinds of problems that adults exhibit. I try not as a professional to allow sort of ethical and moral judgments influence my work with clients. I haven't really thought of the question quite the way you ask it.
Are there many child abuse victims who do not become criminals?
Yes.
And there are many child abuse victims who do become criminals, correct?
There are some child abuse victims who may become criminals.
Do you know the percentage of criminals who have been child abuse victims?
I've never actually seen studies to that. I know that it is often said that large numbers of people in prisons may have child abuse histories, but that's really a methodologically inappropriate way to study the effects. I mean, if you want to study criminals, for example, you go to prisons because that's where lots of criminals are, but there may be an overwhelming, and it is my belief that an overwhelming number of child abuse victims don't end up there. It would be like if you want to study why people become academics and you only went to the university and only looked at academics, you'd have a sample that doesn't represent the entire population. So I think the studies, or I'm not sure they're studies, so I haven't seen them, but the popular press argument about that link is based on flawed methodology.
Would you agree that child abuse as it relates to criminality is becoming a more popular topic in your field?
I would agree that there is a resurgence of interest in academic and in the public in criminality, because lots of us deal with criminal behavior in lots of ways. There are a few criminologists, although they tend to be of the minority of investigators of child abuse. There are a few criminologists who have looked at that link, yes.
But it's beginning to be an area of interest in literature, isn't that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
it's one of many beginning areas that people are exploring. Whether it's going to pan out in the long term, I don't know.
Now, I believe that you indicated that the sexualized behavior between Lyle Menendez and his brother Erik was a classic symptom of child sexual abuse,
Yes.
correct? So inter-siblings sexual behavior is something that is very common in child sexual abuse cases, correct?
Yes, although inter-sibling sexual contact may take place where no abuse has occurred also.
Okay. And that would be something that you might expect to see if you were evaluating somebody to see if they'd been sexually abused as a child. I said might expect to see inter-sibling.
Yes,
All right. And a person could make that up and say that they had had sexual behavior with a sibling in order to convince you that they'd been sexually abused, correct?
they could.
Now, because of the abuse that you've described, did you ever try to get therapy for Lyle Menendez? In other words, therapy to treat him for the abuse?
Did I try to provide therapy?
Right. Did you ever say to Miss Lansing, I think he should get some therapy?
We've had numerous conversations about his need for therapy. Yes.
To your knowledge, has he received any therapy since he's been incarcerated in the county jail?
To my knowledge, he has not, and I would have advised against it prior to the completion of these proceedings.
And why would you have advised against him getting therapy if he was a child abuse victim?
Because the timing of treatment is a critical issue, and I think a person has to be in an environment in which it is conducive to the kind of self-exploration and going inward and perhaps falling apart or not being able to be articulate or not being able to explain yourself. So that many victims who go into treatment find a period of pretty significant deterioration in functioning. And when you have to be as articulate as you've ever been in your whole life, it's not a good time to engage in a process that's going to potentially make you less articulate.
Did you write a report in this case, Dr. Connie?
No.
Is it traditional for you not to write reports in forensic cases?
It's traditional in cases of this type where it's almost assured that there will be testimony not to write a report. In other kinds of cases where the effort is to avoid litigation, then usually a report is requested.
When you've testified for the prosecution in criminal cases, have you provided reports to the prosecution in those cases to be turned over to the defense attorneys?
No.
Now, in determining that Lyle Menendez was isolated, did you consider the trips that he took in evaluating the degree of isolation? In other words, the trips that he took on family vacations as well as by himself.
Yes.
Did you consider the fact that he'd been to Europe twice?
Yes.
Did you consider the fact that he'd been to Australia without his parents?
Yes.
Did you consider those trips to be isolating events?
Well, no, I considered that one could go on those trips and still carry with them a sense of isolation, of being different, of not being able to connect with other people and having a secret. The trips themselves, I don't think were isolating. I think the isolation came from experiences he had over the course of his childhood and early adolescence in his home.
But he was not isolated, such as children who are locked in closets or children who are raised out in the backwoods of the Ozarks and are isolated from other human beings, correct?
Correct, but the term isolation as it is applied is not even intended to refer to physical isolation of the kid who is locked away.
That's a good
But
answer.
a kid who's locked away is physically and emotionally isolated, correct?
Yes,
And they're not seeing other people with whom they can interact or make comparisons about their life and other people's lives, correct?
correct.
Now, did you consider the fact in this case that between 1986 and 1989, Lyle Menendez was often 3,000 miles away from his family?
Yes,
And did you consider the fact that for at least 2 semesters he was at Princeton University,
yes,
and for 1 semester he was at Trenton State University,
yes,
and that for long periods of time he was not in the family home?
yes.
Would that tend to increase or decrease the level of fear he would feel about his parents?
The level of fear?
Well, yes.
Well, when you're away from the object which causes the fear, there probably is no fear. The fear is triggered in the presence of that person who has been violent or abusive in the past.
Do cues, that is cues which trigger fear, do those require reinforcement in order to maintain the same level of validity?
Well, it depends on the type of cue, but no, there's what we call one-time learning. A person can be in an experience which is so traumatic and so anxiety producing that no other exposure to that cue is necessary to produce the same level of fear that one felt at the time it was originally, you were originally exposed to that cue.
For instance, if I were in a plane crash, that might be enough of a trauma to make me not want to get on a plane again, correct?
Yes, I would think so.
All right. And so there would be other, or if I were in a terrible car accident, that would be a cue to me that maybe I don't want to be in a car.
Yeah, or if you were beaten by your husband. I mean, there are any number of experiences that people can have that are so overwhelmingly fear-producing that you don't have to be re-exposed to that event to be afraid it's going to happen again.
Now, I believe you indicated that as a teenager, Lyle Menendez was, I think, either slapped or slugged by his father when he sat in the backseat of a limousine.
Yes.
Would you consider that particular fear-inducing cue to be equivalent to like a plane crash?
No, and I wouldn't consider that, thank you. I wouldn't consider that experience in isolation of all of the events that had gone before sufficient, but it is to produce fear. But given all of the events and childhood experiences that were reinforced by that, I think it was a slug in the mouth, that certainly is sufficient to reinforce fear.
Do you think all parents who physically punish their child are abusing their children?
No.
Do you think corporal punishment is ever justified?
I think that with some children and in some situations, corporal punishment is unavoidable. I think wherever possible, it is healthier for kids and for families to avoid it.
It's a very nuanced answer,
Now, I
like most
believe
of
you
his
made
are.
some mention in your direct testimony about the battered wife syndrome. Is that correct?
Correct.
And the battered wife syndrome is a syndrome where a woman has been beaten. Is that correct?
Yes.
And traditionally, what happens when the woman is beaten is that over time, she learns to recognize in her batterer the signs of an oncoming attack. Correct?
That's part of the battered woman syndrome, yes.
For instance, if every time her husband gets drunk, she gets beaten, then the smell of alcohol on his breath would be a cue to her that she's about to be beaten.
Could be, yes.
Okay. And so what happens is that because of the beatings, the wife or the spouse becomes fearful, correct?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be beatings. It can be a beating, but yes, because of the beating, the wife becomes fearful and searches for cues that will help her predict whether or not that beating is going to reoccur.
But in the most severe cases, you're dealing with ongoing ongoing beatings of women. In other words, there's more than one battering incident in order for it to become cue responsive.
I've talked to many battered women who have had one beating and developed from that one experience hyper alertness and searching for cues to know whether or not it's going to happen again.
So that if Lyle Menendez was slugged by his father on that one occasion in the car and had it on prior occasions as a child, been spanked or hit by his father, would you say that would be enough for him to develop this hypervigilance?
It's a hypothetical question. It's hard for me to take the beating in the face and those few other instances out of the context of a lifelong psychological abuse experience. So, I mean, theoretically, I guess it's possible, but, you know, I wasn't asked to speculate on that kind of thing. I was asked to take his entire life and to understand how, given that life experience, he might become hypervigilant. And in fact, that's what I think happened.
Well, that's your opinion, correct? That's what happened
My
on that
opinion
night.
based on a lot of work, yes.
All right. Now, in analyzing Lyle Menendez's response during the 2 days before his parents were killed. Did you consider the testimony of Lyle Menendez and his brother Erik about why they had to go to San Diego to buy the weapons?
Yes.
And I take it you found that particular explanation to be credible.
Well, I think I found that the entire, not just the 2 days, but from Tuesday on, to be a very confusing, anxiety producing, increasingly fearful time. I'm not sure why they went to San Diego. I think there are lots of reasons that they may have driven that far. I think what is significant is what happened to them on the drive.
Well, are you aware of the fact that both defendants stated that they went to the Big Five in Santa Monica to buy handguns
Yes,
and were unable to buy them?
yes,
And are you familiar with the testimony of Erik Menendez that he at least had in fact picked out this handgun and was preparing to purchase it when he was told that there was a 14-day waiting period?
yes.
Okay. Did you find that to be credible?
I didn't know. I mean, I didn't know what Big Five sold. My understanding subsequent to hearing that story is that the Big Five store only sold pellet or BB pistols or something.
And you're aware of the fact of testimony from, I believe, the defense investigator in this case, that there is no 14-day waiting period for a pellet gun in California. Yes. Okay. Now, in evaluating the credibility of Lyle Menendez, did you think to yourself, maybe they're lying about why they went to San Diego?
Yes.
Okay, now if Lyle Menendez is lying to you, does it change your opinions?
If he's lying to me, it would, yes.
All right. So there's no way that you as a trained professional have a meter by which you can determine whether or not he's lying to you.
I'm not a lie detector.
Right.
I do, over the course of an evaluation and interacting with a client, hearing how they present and what they talk about, I do come, as I think I testified before, to an understanding of whether they are essentially telling the truth or not on critical factors. I'm not sure that the trip to San Diego was a critical factor.
Well, if one were to purchase a weapon in advance of a killing, one might construe that as premeditation or planning activity, wouldn't one?
Right. One might consider that fear too.
All right, but another interpretation is that as planning to kill.
Sure.
So if one were to lie about why one bought a weapon, that might be crucial to a finding of planning, wouldn't it?
Sure.
All right. And so when you learned that the Big Five in Santa Monica stopped selling handguns in 1986, did you think to yourself, maybe I'm being sold a bill of goods?
Well, I thought that thought came to me periodically throughout the evaluation, and I'm comfortable that I was not sold a bill of goods on critical factors.
And
If
so,
I thought to the contrary, I wouldn't be here right now.
correct. So you decided that the reason for purchasing in the guns in San Diego was not a critical factor, so you could forgive the apparent inconsistency in what was testified to.
Well,
Would that be fair to say?
It's not an issue of forgiving, but it's an issue of taking the weight of evidence which supports credibility, not having the full capacity to assess all aspects of that particular incident. I mean, the explanation sounded credible to me. I understand you have a different theory, but I haven't heard anything yet that really challenges what I was told.
And the phone calls to Perry Berman in order to go to the movies that night, I take it that in your mind was a fact which was completely consistent with what Lyle Menendez explained to you as to why he did it. In other words, you never thought to yourself, maybe he was setting up an alibi. Would that be fair to say?
No, I thought of it. Sure, I did.
But you rejected that as well.
Yes.
And would you agree with me that purchasing a weapon 2 days in advance, setting up an alibi several hours before a killing might be construed by some people as being planning activity?
Well, some people might construe it that way. Some people might also construe the purchase of a weapon as preparing to defend oneself.
Let me inquire how much longer you think it'll be.
Probably another hour.
All right, well, let's take a recess and resume at 11:15. Don't discuss the matter. You may continue your cross-examination.
Dr. Conte, I believe you testified on Friday that, in your opinion, Lyle Menendez wanted to protect his parents' memory.
Yes.
All right. Did you ever consider the fact that if Lyle Menendez had taken the stand in front of this jury and as a snarling ogre had said he hated his parents, that that wouldn't look too good for him?
Questions, argument.
Rephrase the question. Objection sustained.
Dr. Conte, did you ever consider the fact that if Lyle Menendez said to you that he hated his parents, that that would be detrimental to the defense that's being offered in this case?
Well, of course, but it's not just the verbal behavior. I look for subtle signs as well. I look for consistency while interacting with someone over time. I don't necessarily expect what someone says as a statement is the only factor I'm going to take in considering motive and emotional state.
Do you believe that an interviewee can pick up cues from their interviewer as to what answers they should give?
I believe an interviewee can. I tried to not communicate cues. One of the things that therapists are trained to do, in fact, is to control personal reactions and personal biases and things that would indicate to a client or an interviewee sort of what one's feeling is. I sometimes try to even suggest an opposite direction to see if the person will respond. But yeah, I mean, certainly it's possible that someone can sense, an interviewee can sense.
How would you rate Lyle Menendez in terms of intelligence? You spent a lot of hours with him. How would you rate him in terms of his
Well,
intelligence?
I understand that Dr. Hart said his scores were in the above average. My sense of him was in the average to slightly above average intellectual range.
I believe you indicated that battered women are afraid of being in confined spaces with their husbands. And you related that testimony in regards to the boat, the fishing trip on the Saturday night. Remember
Yes.
your testimony in that regard? Yes. Okay. Well, when a woman is alone in a confined space as her home with her husband, she's alone with him, correct?
Yes,
They're not two shipmates and a girlfriend present, correct?
correct.
And in most cases, that home is the site of prior batterings.
Yes,
Okay, a ship where you've never been before certainly cannot be construed as the site of prior beatings.
no, but if your entire life experience has given you the belief that your parents are all powerful, that they can kill you, that they can arrange with others to kill you, then being on a boat where you think that the crew and the captain may be in league with your father, that's hardly a secure place to be.
Well, that's assuming you were told the truth by Lyle Menendez about what he thought about the boat.
Of
Correct?
course it is. But in every way that is possible to me, over all the time that I have been with this young man, I believe that he is essentially truthful on the critical factors. Now, no human being can report every event that they ever had, and he is an untreated victim, and so he may in some ways behave as an untreated victim. But I find nothing that suggests that he was dishonest with me and was not trying to tell me as the best he could about his life experiences and about the week before his parents died.
Are you familiar with the Rosenhan study that Dr. Hart testified about?
Yes,
And you're familiar with the fact that that was a study conducted at a Stanford University, correct?
yes,
Where people fabricated symptomology in order to be admitted to mental health institutions.
right. But that was a study that was done many years ago that found that you could train people to fake psychological and psychiatric symptoms.
Now,
That is not really the issue that's part of this evaluation. It's not really the issue that we're dealing with today.
but in evaluating Lyle Menendez in terms of his credibility, you looked at certain symptoms to see if they were corroborative of a pattern of abuse.
That's correct.
So symptomology was important.
Well, not symptomology as is used in that study, which I think tended to be quite gross symptoms such as psychosis.
People were reporting they were hearing things,
Right,
correct?
right.
All right. And the study seemed to show that people could be trained to make those reports in order to gain admission to psychiatric
Right,
institutions.
on very gross symptoms such as hearing voices.
Well,
What I'm talking about in my interaction with Lyle over all the hours and all the months are much more subtle kinds of processes which I, number one, don't think you could train another person to do. And two, I don't think you could train someone to do it in a believable way.
Have you ever diagnosed anyone as malingering?
This is very interesting. The point that she's trying to get at is like, well, look, there's this study, the Rosenhan study, which shows that people can even be trained to to fake these symptoms and get their way into a mental institution. And what he's saying is like, he's like, okay, but that doesn't fit here because those were really big symptoms, really big symptoms that people were faking. Here, we're talking about very nuanced things that the patient was telling me, which is much more nuanced, which it to me, it lends even more credibility, which is like, if he was faking it, he would have at the very least, a maybe a tendency, or maybe a desire, maybe to like exaggerate those, like how many people, when they are trying to appear like someone that has certain symptoms when they don't have them, how many times are they going to go subtle on that? I don't know. That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that particularly before. Maybe there are instances where people have successfully, faked it while using like subtle symptoms, but I don't know. That's a very, very interesting point that he made here.
I'm never given the diagnosis.
And the question from Pam just was, have you ever diagnosed anyone as malingering? So just in case anyone forgot, because of my commentary.
Of malingering, I have suggested that victims have exaggerated the level of trauma and the level of symptomatology resulting from abuse. But those are, I think, exaggerations.
Versus total outright fabrications.
Yes.
And you've never decided that someone was just outright lying to you and fabricating things.
Oh, I have, sure. I've done evaluations of children and of adults who claim abuse where I think abuse did not take place.
Now, in your evaluation of Lyle Menendez, did you consider the 911 tape recording that he made? Did you listen to it?
Yes.
And you were aware of the fact that on that tape he was lying to the police?
Yes.
And you were aware that on that tape he was conveying information to the police to mislead?
Yes.
Okay. You're aware of the fact that shortly after being taken to the Beverly Hills Police Department on the morning of the 21st of August, he again lied to the police?
Yes.
Correct. Now, it is not uncommon for someone caught in a crime to lie about their participation in the crime, is it?
I don't think it's uncommon for people who are caught in a crime, and I don't think it's uncommon for people who are in a highly emotional state to be inaccurate in the information that they provide. I think that you really, in this case, have sort of two different events that you're trying to understand. You have the events leading up to Lyle's parents' deaths, and then you have the post-event activities. I don't find that what you're calling the lies and the misstatements that I think take place largely in a state of great fear and confusion and anxiety, in which the individual understandably might be trying to save themselves. I don't think those are all that helpful in understanding pre-death events.
Well, what about the fact that he lied to reporters who interviewed him? Did you consider that at all interesting in your evaluation of him?
Well, again, it is post-event behavior.
But it's behavior that occurred some period of time after the events which he says caused him to kill his parents.
Yes.
Okay, and talking to the reporters a month after the crime he's not acting under the same emotional state as he would have been during the 911 call.
No, but I think he may well have been acting. In fact, I think he was acting in a sense of trying, out of grief, out of confusion, trying to figure out how to live post this time. I think perhaps trying to get some kind of a life after the end of his life that he had known it.
Are you aware of the fact that when he talked to Sergeant Edmonds in the early morning hours of the 21st of August, that he suggested his father's business as the motivator for the crime?
Yeah, I remember reading something to that effect.
Are you aware of the fact that later on he told people, specifically a bodyguard that he'd hired, that the mob was responsible for his father's death, his
Well,
parents' death?
I think that was part of the statement. I also think in the same statement, he said they probably weren't responsible.
Well, I'm talking about the testimony of Richard Wenskowski. Did you read his testimony in this courtroom?
I don't recall.
And did you consider hiring limousines and bodyguards to be part of the grief response?
Grief, it's a confusing time.
Did you consider buying a $10,000 Rolex watch to be part of the grief response?
Oh, spending money is probably the most common thing that people do when they're grieving. And it's a confusing time, and buying suits kind of like your dad would wear to kind of try to take on some of your dad's power to deal with it, or buying watches. I mean, that's quite consistent with grieving and confusion and trying to figure out what your life is going to be like after this tragedy.
What an answer. It's like, hi, Pam, have you ever heard of retail therapy? I mean, was that a term in 1993? I don't know. But like, that's definitely a term today that we can all agree exists in some realms. I can totally see somebody just going out on a shopping spree to like drown their sorrows.
So it's consistent for someone who suffered the kind of abuse that you indicate Lyle Menendez has, who killed his parents. It's consistent that 4 days after the crime that they would go out and buy 3 Rolex watches. You don't find that at all troubling in your analysis?
I don't find it at all troubling. First of all, it's consistent with how this family and this young man spent money throughout most of their lives and his life. It is an extremely confusing time. There's grieving. I mean, he had the capacity that other people don't to buy four Rolex watches or whatever, but I don't find that that's at all inconsistent. And again, it is post-event behavior, and the principles for understanding that post-event behavior may be very different than understanding the factors that led up to that event. But to go after the event and to take certain behaviors and then try to go back and describe or understand the lead up to the event, I think is taking things out of sequence.
Dr. Conte, you said it was a confusing time for Lyle Menendez. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would you agree that the minutes right after the shootings would have been more confusing than the shopping trip at the Century City Mall when the watches were purchased?
Yes.
All right. And did you consider the fact that during this very confusing time, right after the shootings, he had the presence of mind to think about fingerprints on the shotgun shells?
I don't know that that's what he was thinking. I mean, people after an incredibly traumatic, horrible, tragic event may do things that are difficult to understand. I tried to cut off accidentally my thumb with a saw one time and instantly put it into my mouth because that's what you do often when you cut your finger. The problem is that there was massive amounts of blood coming out. I mean, people do strange things in traumatic situations.
But by going back and picking up the shotgun shells, he eliminated fingerprints which could have led to his arrest.
Ma'am, Jackie Kennedy tried to get on the back of the limousine to get her husband's skull.
No.
People do very strange things in extremely frightening, traumatic events.
But
I don't know that he was going to get fingerprints. I mean, if this was a premeditated bad thing he was doing, I'd assume he'd wipe the fingerprints off the shells before he put them in.
Do you consider collecting evidence to avoid apprehension to be something strange?
I don't know that that's what that behavior was. In the same way that I can't understand what Mrs. Kennedy was doing on the back of the limousine in that incredibly horrible seconds after those shots. I don't know that that's what was being done. Maybe it was.
Did anyone have the Kennedy assassination on their bingo card for this trial? Because like, I certainly didn't. Okay, but here we are.
It was a horrible mess. Maybe it was an effort to clean up. It's hard.
But Dr. Connie Lyle Menendez testified that when he went out into the hallway, he thought to himself, I better go back and get those shells. There are fingerprints on them. And if
Oh.
he'd wiped them off beforehand, there was no guarantee that he would have gotten all of the fingerprints so as to leave the shells behind. Do you think that's analogous to Jackie Kennedy grabbing the top of her husband's head?
Well, I think it is analogous to the kinds of how trauma influences people's ability to do things in traumatic events.
Do you think that Lyle Menendez was suffering from trauma when he returned to the scene of the crime, went through his car in the presence of a police officer, and attempted to secrete further evidence which would link him to the crime? Was that a traumatic response?
Well, it depends on, I think that the behavior in that evening and the days following is a period of great confusion and great anxiety.
But actually, a confused person might not have thought so clearly to get rid of the fingerprints on the shells and to go back to the car and get rid of the shells in the car, correct?
A confused person might think with great clarity on those matters, or they may think with a lack of clarity on those factors.
Now, did
Excuse me.
you personally speak to Lyle Menendez about what actually happened during the shootings of his parents?
Yes.
And did you read his testimony in that regard?
I don't recall whether I read it or viewed it.
Okay, do you remember his testimony about the shot to the back of his father's head? Do you remember him testifying that?
Yes, I don't remember the specifics, but I do recall it, yes.
Was that kind of shot to the back of the head, a contact wound such as that, was that an act of confusion in your opinion?
Confusion, fear. Yes,
Would also be consistent with someone who wanted to kill the person and had planned to kill the person.
be consistent with that, would be consistent who would want to be sure that the threat was no longer a threat.
And do you think that he was acting out of confusion when on Saturday he and his brother went and purchased buckshot because all they had was birdshot from the day before? You think he was confused when he thought, gee, I better get stronger ammunition?
No, I think he was fearful and anxious and wasn't sure what was going on and was doing, as he's done lots of times in his life, reaching out for advice from other people.
And that's why he went to buy stronger ammunition? Is that your interpretation, Dr. Conte?
What I just said was my interpretation,
Right.
yes.
Now, the fact that he unloaded his gun and then reloaded his gun before he went in to shoot his parents, did you consider that to be an act of confusion?
Confusion, overwhelming fear, yes.
Now, are you familiar with the shot to Jose Menendez's left knee, which entered on the inside of his thigh and exited through the outside?
Yes.
Did you see anything in his testimony or in anything that where you were talking to him that would explain how that particular shot occurred?
I don't recall it.
Okay, so nothing. So did you ever look at that particular injury to Mr. Menendez's leg and think, gee, I wonder how that occurred?
I felt that about all the shots. I'm not a forensic expert. I looked at the photographs and I read the coroner's report.
All right, but even if you're not a forensic expert, you do have some common sense, correct? I'm not being argumentative. People have common sense.
I hope so, yes.
All right. And did you ever think to yourself, well, Lyle Menendez said that he reloaded once with birdshot, but Kitty Menendez has 2 birdshot injuries. Did that ever strike you as being an inconsistency in his testimony or what he told you?
It didn't strike me as an inconsistency, no.
Okay, well, you understand that the testimony is that he reloaded 1 round of birdshot and put the gun up against his mother's cheek and fired it.
Yes, but
You understand that Mrs. Menendez has another wound that travels across her left shoulder and lodges in the left side of her neck,
yes,
and that's also birdshot.
yes.
So that
But
would
again, in a state of incredible fear and anxiety, I'm not sure that an individual, in fact, I doubt an individual will be completely aware of what kind of ammunition they're putting in a shotgun, especially if they don't have prior knowledge about ammunition for shotguns.
If a person doesn't have prior knowledge about shotguns and is in a heightened emotional state, wouldn't you expect them to be less able to unload and reload a gun than a person who wasn't in fear and had prior knowledge?
Well, I don't think it takes a whole lot of either intellectual or non-fearful behavior to load a shotgun. I've only done it once, but it's a fairly easy thing to do.
Do you know how to unload a shotgun without firing the round?
Yeah, I did.
Now, you indicated that you don't consider post-crime behavior, and I may be summarizing this too broadly, but you don't consider post-crime behavior to be indicative of pre-crime state of mind. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I don't think it's as directly relevant as the other factors pre-crime. I mean, obviously, behavior is correlated. And so what you do, we have some event we're trying to understand at time 1. Obviously, things that come after time 1 at time 10 can be important. It isn't clear to me that they are as important, though, than the pre-time events and factors in understanding that thing that took place at time 1.
But in this particular case, the pre-crime events seem to rely upon the credibility of the defendants, whereas many of the post-crimes activities are actually documented, wouldn't you say?
Well, but many of the post events are also reports. And, many of them are confusing and they're hard to understand. But, if this guy was going to lie, he certainly could have come up with a whole host of better lies to explain the events of the week before and the events after. Some of this is very confusing and it doesn't make sense. On the Big Five issue and whether they sold guns, very confusing. But why would he even tell us that? I mean, I don't see why he would tell us that if he wanted to lie, to make up a lie that would be believable and convincing.
So when criminals lie, in your opinion, they don't normally make mistakes. Is that correct?
Oh, I'm sure all human beings make mistakes.
You're aware of the fact that Lyle Menendez wasn't even arrested in this case until March of 1990, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so he was at liberty for a long time after the killings.
Correct.
Now, in spite of the fact that he was fearful and in a heightened state of confusion after the killings of his parents, did you consider it all unique or interesting that he was able, with his brother, to concoct a phony alibi to tell to the police? In other words, that he was able to think, well, let's go to the movies, let's get rid of the guns, let's change our clothes, and let's go to Santa Monica and call Perry Berman. Did you consider that to be an act of someone who was acting in a state of confusion?
I think someone who is confused and in fear and with a need to do something could do those things which you just described. Yeah, I don't see that inconsistent at all.
Okay, that would also be consistent with someone, that particular chain of events would also be consistent with someone who planned it out beforehand.
Well, sure, anything is possible.
Now, have you ever personally examined the route that was taken to see if, in fact, there was enough time between the shootings and the phone call to Perry Berman at 11:07?
No, my understanding is that there's contradictory forensic evidence on that issue.
Forensic evidence, are you talking about timing?
Timing by different investigators, yes.
All right. And did you ever look at his testimony and add up the amount of time that he spent that night and think to yourself, this might not have been able to have occurred?
No.
You didn't even consider that possibility?
Well, I considered the whole events. You asked me if I added up the time from the testimony. I didn't add up the time from the testimony.
If it turned out that all those events couldn't have happened in 67 minutes, would it change your opinion as to the truthfulness of what you were told by Lyle Menendez?
Well, again, my understanding of what took place is based on a whole range of facts collected from this individual over a long period of time. If you tell me that it absolutely, those events could not have happened, I would need to know, did in fact all those events take place? I mean, he was highly confused what he was describing. Maybe he left things out. I mean, there are a host of factors which could explain what you're telling me now is an inconsistency in the amount of time that something would take.
What his events immediately after the homicides, those events are particularly important to this particular case, wouldn't you say?
Oh, I don't think they're as important as the events that led up to it at all, no.
Okay, but the events that led up to it depend upon the credibility of Mr. Menendez, correct?
In part, but credibility, which is support by a host of collaborative indicators or evidence. And there's more corroboration in this case for significant aspects of the history and of that last week than you usually find in this type of case. So it's not just what Lyle told me happened.
Dr. Conte, as to the events on Tuesday, August the 15th, where Mrs. Menendez allegedly took the hairpiece off of her son, the only witnesses to that event would be Lyle Menendez, his brother Erik, and Mrs. Menendez.
Yes.
There's no independent corroboration. In other words, you don't have a police report of a battery. You don't have a hospital visit to treat his wounded head. You don't have any other way to verify that particular event.
Well, that's not, we have frantic calls from California to Jose at his mother's house. So we know that something was going on. So there is some corroboration that something significant is taking place that evening.
But we don't know if Lyle Menendez is telling the truth about what happened that night as far as independent corroboration, correct?
Correct.
And on Wednesday, you don't have any independent corroboration of the activities of these brothers on Wednesday, aside from what they told you, correct?
I'd have to look at all the events on Wednesday to see whether that's true or not. But
Now, Thursday night, when Mr. Menendez came home and Lyle Menendez allegedly had this conversation with his father, you have no independent corroboration of that, correct?
that's correct. But his description is consistent with the types of talks that used to take place between father and son in the past.
If those talks in the past had actually happened, how difficult would it be to say that another one occurred on the night of Thursday, the 17th of August?
Not difficult.
If one has had an event happen in the past and remembers the details of that event, it's not hard to say, well, it just happened yesterday, when in fact it happened 2 years before.
Of course not.
And memory can work that way, correct?
Sure.
Now, do you have any independent corroboration? Well, there is independent corroboration of the fact that the shotguns were purchased in San Diego using Donovan Goodrow's identification, correct?
Correct.
But as far as the motivation for going to San Diego, there's no independent corroboration except for the word of Lyle and Erik Menendez.
That's correct.
Now, we know.
Well, I mean, okay, I don't know. I guess there are ways of getting corroboration for their motivation, but like that's mostly something that's inside their brains anyway. So I don't know. That's a weird question.
know that on Saturday night, the 19th of August, there was a boat trip, correct?
Correct.
You're aware of the fact that during that boat trip, the parents were, Mr. Menendez was fishing.
Yes.
You're aware of the fact that Mrs. Menendez and her sons and her husband were looking at seals that they saw during the course of their trip. Do you remember the testimony of Mr. Robert Anderson?
It's the boat captain.
Yes,
Yes, he's the one who described Lyle and Erik sort of huddling at the front of the boat.
correct. He's also the one who described the fact that they were fishing and that they were looking at the seals and things like
I
that.
don't think he described the boys fishing. I think he described that they looked at the seals and that Mrs. Menendez was quite interested in the seals.
Correct. And Mrs. Menendez looking at the seals was not threatening to these particular defendants.
No, in fact, that's sort of the whole point, that what happens in these events is that there is something that is very threatening that increases the anxiety, and then there is something benign or innocuous which may tend to decrease it a little bit, and then something else which is perceived as a threat increases. So the sight of the seals may have sort of reduced the fear. It's not constant buildup of fear with no variation over time.
But
It goes up and down.
But that's dependent upon the account of the fear that you've gotten from Lyle Menendez, correct?
Of course.
Because you can't corroborate the ripping off of the hairpiece, and you can't corroborate the discussion with Mr. Menendez on Thursday night, correct?
That's correct.
Now, the events of August the 20th of 1989, in terms of what happened during the day, the only independent corroboration comes from Perry Berman, who had a telephone call with Lyle Menendez, correct? Is that correct?
Correct. I'm sorry.
And then we know that there was a phone call to Perry Berman from Santa Monica Civic at 11:07 p.m., correct?
I believe so.
And we also know that the defendants must have gone to the movie theater because they knew that a movie was sold out, correct?
Correct.
You're aware of the fact that traditionally,
Which that's not a logical step that we would need for today, because obviously you can just look something up by, on your phone, which there would be evidence of that too, because digital forensics are totally a thing.
you can't know if a movie is sold out by calling the theater. You need to go to the theater.
I didn't know that, but if you tell me, I'll assume
Well,
it if you want.
do you go to the movies ever?
Once in a rare while.
All right. When you call up, I don't know if it works this way in Seattle, but when you call up, do you usually get a tape recording? Of
Yes.
All right. There's no way that these defendants could have known that the movie was sold out without visiting the theater, as far as you know. Is that correct?
Well, sure. If there's no, in Seattle, you can always wait till the recording is over and then call the box office. I mean, if you want me to assume it, I'm happy to assume that there's no way.
And nobody has told you that there was any other way for these particular defendants to know that License to Kill was sold out without visiting the theater, correct? All right. And we can also verify that at 11:47 p.m., there was a call to the police, a 911 call, correct?
Correct.
All right. So those are things that are verifiable, correct? But as far as these particular defendants' state of mind and their level of fear, especially as to Lyle Menendez, you can't verify it with anything like phone records, correct? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Or movie theater times or anything else. Those kinds of things can't corroborate his particular state of mind.
It's characteristic of these cases and battered women cases that you cannot corroborate the battered woman or the battered child or the battered person's state of mind.
Correct. Now, there is no scientific way for you to check the data that you were given about these things we've just been talking about. And that is the state of mind, correct?
There's no scientific way I know to check. That's correct.
Okay. And if the information from Lyle Menendez is untrue about his childhood experiences, and I'm leaving out the events of the week of August 20th, okay?
I understand.
If we're just talking about the child abuse, correct? And you take out his version of it, would you agree that at least this family was somewhat dysfunctional? Leaving aside what he told you, the things you got from other sources.
Excessively pathological, yes.
Okay. Dysfunctional is a popular term now, but would you agree it was dysfunctional?
Sure.
All right. And you add in the information from Lyle Menendez and that corroborates it, correct?
Correct.
All right. Now, if the information about Lyle Menendez's state of mind during the week of October 15th through 20th is untrue, that would change your opinion, wouldn't it?
Well, sure, if it were untrue. But
No. But what?
well, you're asking me to assume something which I, based on a thorough evaluation, 60 some hours with this individual, and all of my experience as a clinician, I don't believe to be untruthful. So you're asking me to assume something. I mean, I'll assume it if you want to do a hypothetical or something, but it goes against everything that I've learned. The inability to corroborate what someone tells you clinically through science is a state of clinical practice. But every clinician who treats and every clinician who does forensic evaluations evaluates the information and comes to some determination about the credibility or the trustworthiness of that information.
And so you're relying on your own experience and your expertise. And
What an answer. He gave that was such a great answer. She gave him an opening and he took it. He's like, I mean, I'll go along with your hypothetical, but I just want to make it super clear that I definitely disagree with that assumption.
you're arriving at your opinion, correct?
Correct.
But there is no way to test whether or not someone's telling the truth, is there?
That's correct.
Now, during the time that you've testified, both Friday and today, have you used notes in order to refresh your memory?
Yes.
How many occasions?
I have no idea.
During the end of your direct examination, you related several specific events that had occurred during the week between August the 15th and August the 20th. You talked about the boat trip. You talked about Mrs. Menendez, things that she'd said. You talked about the ripping off of the hairpiece. Do you remember your testimony in that regard?
Yeah.
And you related to this jury verbatim things that were said by either the parents or the defendants during that week period.
Correct.
And you did that from your memory, didn't you?
I don't know. That depends on what event we're talking about.
Well, the events of the week of August 15th through the 20th, you have a fairly good understanding of the chronology of events, correct?
I hope so, but
And you have a very good understanding of the contents of the events. Is that correct?
for some of the events, yes.
And I believe you've testified to exact quotes. That is, Mrs. Menendez saying things like, this family could have worked out.
Yes.
And you found the use of the past tense significant,
Yes.
correct? So you were able to relate to this jury without much aid from your notes, the chronology, the contents, and sometimes verbatim, the words that were said during that week.
Well, I actually believe I had my notes out at the time and did check periodically. But So I'm not sure what you're getting at, but some of the things I remember and some of the things I had to look down and look at my notes. That's just
But you
the
have,
limits of my memory, I guess.
okay, and you have a fairly good understanding of those particular events, correct?
I have an understanding of many of the events. Some things that partly because of the anxiety of being up here, I may have misspoken or I may have been confused about, and I have to sort of look down.
Now, you also related to the jury, many incidences from Lyle Menendez's life that you've either learned about from him or heard about from other sources, correct?
Yes,
And you told Miss Lansing during her direct examination a compilation of events which led you to your conclusions.
yes,
And you were able to remember those events, correct?
yes.
And you were able to talk under cross-examination about those events.
I've tried
Why couldn't Lyle Menendez do the same thing?
because Lyle could. But when Lyle told me, I was filtering what Lyle told me through my experience as a clinician, through my experience with other battered children and knowing what the literature on battering is. I looked from Lyle, and I'm sure you looked from me, for subtle signs of anxiety or confusion or psychological process or what have you.
And in spite of all that, it's still your opinion that Lyle Menendez acted out of fear on the night that he killed his parents. Is that correct?
Fear and confusion, yes.
And not that this was a planned killing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Redirect.
Your Honor, I believe my redirect couldn't take both of them. So,
Let's get about 10 minutes or so.
Okay. We are through the cross-examination.
Dr. Conte, when Mrs. Bazanich began today, she was asking you about the letters that you read, referring to Mrs. Menendez's letters,
Yes.
which we marked earlier. And she asked you if you felt compassion.
Also, I'm sorry I haven't been pinning in the chat redirect. I've been adding to the description a what's it called? The timestamps, so that should show up on the stream, but I just realized I haven't been pinning the changes in direct, cross exam, redirect. So I'll start pinning that now.
Passion for Kitty Menendez. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you said you did.
Yes.
Why?
Well, I try to feel empathy and compassion. I try to be sensitive
That was
to who the
hard
people
to listen to.
in a case are. It's part of the job that a clinician has to use his or her emotions and understanding and empathy for other people to understand what the situation of all those people in an event are.
And when you say you felt compassion for Kitty Menendez, was part of your evaluation to look at what her life had been like from her childhood on?
Yes.
And based on your knowledge of her childhood, did you feel compassion for her experiences?
Yes.
At that time.
Beyond the scope and call for improper opinion.
Objection overruled. That answer will stand, but that doesn't put us in a different posture in this situation.
And when you were considering all the facts in the case, did you feel compassion for the other people in the case, for Mr. Menendez, for Jose Menendez,
Yes, in the same sense.
and for all of their relatives?
Yes.
And did you view this as a situation in which there were a great number of people who suffered greatly?
Yes.
And you personally interviewed a number of those people, is that correct?
Yes.
And did you find in getting information from family members, from friends, from people who knew Mr. and Mrs. Menendez, that they were eager to say bad things about these people, or that they were conflicted in that regard?
Oh, I think
Objection calls for speculation.
Overruled.
quite conflicted.
And can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I think people, but especially family members, give up information, especially information which is perceived as negative about other family members. They tend to give it up quite reluctantly. and with a great deal of concern. These are complex, ambivalent relationships in an extremely dysfunctional family. And so the act of telling and revealing is very complicated, and it's hard for family members to sort out or separate their own feelings from what they're telling. And so it's not just in this type of case, but I think in families in general, it is very difficult for people to give up the family secrets and the family pathologies.
When you interviewed the family members, did you find that they had rallied behind Lyle and Erik and they were willing to say anything that would help the two boys without any concern for the parents' memory?
Objection, calls for speculation.
Rephrase the question.
When you were receiving this information, did you feel that the family members were exaggerating bad things about the parents to help the boys? Or did you feel that they were still trying to protect the parents' memory?
Oh, I think I think that it's pretty clear that in all of the people I talked about, they had exceedingly ambivalent and complicated feelings about what they were telling and about their cousin and about what their cousin had done. And so I found them quite reluctant to reveal or to describe, and quite ambivalent in the process.
Do you think the result of that was that you got negative information about the parents that was exaggerated or was minimized?
Objection, improper conclusion.
You have to rephrase the question. Objection sustained.
In evaluating the information that you received by interviewing other family members, did you factor into it their relationship to Kitty and Jose Menendez?
Yes.
And did you feel that their relationship to Kitty and Jose Menendez had an impact on the information they were giving you?
Yes.
And what impact did it have?
Well, I think the relationship and indeed some of their own problems and inability to accurately see tended to minimize what they shared rather than to exaggerate.
And did you find that some of these family members had some sense of responsibility that if they really saw bad things, they should have done something about it, and so there's a motivation for them to minimize what they saw for that reason as well?
Well, not all of the family members, but I think some of the family members certainly felt great guilt and responsibility over not having done something earlier to prevent this problem. And I think when people have that kind of feeling, they often will minimize what they tell you.
In talking to Lyle Menendez, did you find that he was eager to tell you negative things about his parents?
No, I think Lyle's giving up of information was quite hesitant, and he, even when he would describe a negative thing, he often tried to put it in the best light. And my viewing of the testimony in court is that he tended from time to time as well to kind of minimize it or try to put a spin on it that would protect his parents.
Your Honor, I move to strike the information about his
Testimony in court is being improper opinion of the witness.
Sustained as to that portion of the answer. That is stricken. The rest will stand.
When you watched the videotapes of Lyle's testimony in court, did you hear him relate events that he had also talked to you about?
Yes.
And did you find in that testimony in court that he minimized those events compared to how he had described them to you?
Yes.
And was that a pattern in his testimony, this pattern of minimizing or protecting his parents?
Yes, and I have some samples with me from the testimony that I think quite clearly illustrate that minimization and that protection.
Did you find also in interviewing Lyle Menendez and in watching his testimony that he was protective toward his brother?
Oh, yes.
And did you find that he went out of his way to take responsibility for the events of the last week?
objection, improper opinion.
Sustained.
In reviewing the material that you were given in talking to Lyle and Erik Menendez and then looking at Lyle's testimony, do you feel that he took more responsibility in court for his actions or less than what he had described to you?
Objection, improper opinion.
You have to be more specific. Objection sustained.
Were there instances in which Lyle Menendez in court described events that placed more responsibility on himself than when he had talked to you about them.
Yes.
With regard to Kitty Menendez's letters, you were asked by Mrs. Bozanich if you believe those letters reflected that she loved her children. Do you remember that question?
Yes, I do.
And I believe you indicated that you didn't believe she loved her children.
Yes.
Why was that?
Well, if you look at this entire history, her entire history, described not only by her sons, but by other relatives, we find, I think, a consistent pattern of not caring for their needs, not being concerned about the impact of her behavior and other events on their development. I think we find a pattern of rather selfish behavior, locking him in his bedroom, for example, and not letting him come out, because if he came out, that might cause her to engage in some parenting behavior when he was very young. I mean, you find a pattern of sort of not meeting his needs, not being empathetic, not understanding who he is or what he was needed, of essentially rejecting him. And so, love is an easy word to throw around, but if you look at her behavior as described by relatives and by her son over his entire life with her, I don't find any evidence of love. She may say she loved him, and who knows? But her behavior certainly didn't communicate it.
Do all mothers love their children?
No.
Is there a way of looking at a person's childhood and to help you determine whether they're going to be able to love or bond with their children? Can you look at factors in that woman's childhood that will give you indicators of her ability to make that connection?
Yeah.
And beyond 12.
Sustain the answer straight.
Can we approach on that, Your Honor?
Let's go on to something else, and we'll take a break shortly.
You were asked about your own training.
Yes.
You recall that? Did you take classes in diagnosing mental illnesses?
Well, I had courses in which mental diseases and disorders were described. At the time I was in the master's program was just about the time that the diagnostic manual was switching from 2 to 3, as I remember. And so there were not specific course content on DSM-3R. I certainly had coursework that dealt with a range of behavioral and social science theory and knowledge and research, which helps us understand human beings and human behavior.
And do you now teach something along these lines?
2 of the last 4 years I've been at the University of Washington, I have taught the course on adult psychopathology, which is it is teaching social workers how to use the diagnostic manual we've been referring to in conducting assessments and rendering a diagnosis of an individual.
Are these graduate students you teach?
These are graduate students who are the first or second year students interested in mental health or in becoming clinical social workers or sometimes working in health settings.
And so you teach them how to diagnose
Yes,
people? And you also have a clinical practice, I take it?
yes.
So you do therapy.
I do therapy with children, adolescents, and adults with trauma histories.
So I take it you've been trained somewhere along the line how to do therapy?
Yes.
One of the points that Mrs. Bozanich kept returning to in her questioning of you was whether you were lied to, whether you were fooled. Is that correct?
Correct.
And she started, the first time that she visited this issue, she talked about contamination. Is
Yes.
that correct? And I believe that she was asking you whether it was possible that the person you interview, in this case, Lyle Menendez, could have received other information that would enable him to fool you. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, when you're doing any sort of evaluation, is it important to you to be as right as humanly possible? Whether you're treating the person or evaluating them for a court setting?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not only an ethical obligation in the specific case, but if you are sloppy or you become wrong or you're fooled, it can influence your entire future career. So it's an ethical obligation to the person or to the system for whom you're doing the evaluation, and it's also self-protective.
Now, you hold some important positions within the community you operate in, is that correct? In terms of you're an editor of 2 different journals, is that
Yes.
correct? And when other people want to publish articles in other journals besides yours, are you sometimes the person who does the review of that work to see if it's accurate?
If it's accurate, if the methodology was appropriate, and if the conclusions are warranted, yes.
And do you have a position in the National Academy of the Sciences?
Yes.
And what is that?
Well, I was one of the child abuse researchers, experts that was on a panel on child abuse and neglect research for the National Academy of Sciences. And our task, the panel's task, was to review research in child abuse and neglect and to make recommendations to the federal government about an agenda for research for the nation over the next decade.
And is your work cited by other people in the field who write?
Yes.
When other people write articles, do they refer to books or articles that you've written or papers you've presented?
Yes.
So do you have a reputation that's important to you to protect within your professional community?
Essentially, my reputation is all I have. I mean, I have some skill and some knowledge. I tell everyone that I've ever evaluated that I will not exaggerate for them. I won't misstate information, because my responsibility is not just to that individual, but it is to every individual that will ever need me for anything. I'll do the best job I can once my opinion has been rendered, but my integrity is essentially all I really have that means anything. And at the point I'm regarded as someone whose opinion is for sale or manipulation, I'm pointless. I might as well go into another line of work.
You knew that in testifying in this case, that the positions that you took and the opinions you expressed would be widely disseminated. Is that correct?
And I assume that they would be analyzed by colleagues and people who weren't very friendly to me for a long time. That's correct.
And do you usually spend 500 hours in a case?
No.
How much time do you usually spend in a case that's for court presentation?
Well, criminal cases like this tend to be a little bit more than the other kinds of cases, but I would think 3 or 4, sometimes 5 days.
And in this case, you obviously spent a great deal more.
Yes.
Did you do everything within your power to make sure that the opinion you rendered here was an accurate one?
Yes.
Do you usually interview independently the number of witnesses you interviewed in this case?
No.
Were you making an attempt to be as independent as possible in this case?
Yes.
Now, the prosecution indicated that, asked if you contacted them.
Yes.
If they had produced material for you to read, would you have read it and considered it?
Yes.
If they had suggested specific witnesses for you to interview, would you have done so?
Yes.
Did you make the determination in terms of the witnesses you would interview rather than me?
I did.
Were there any limits placed on who you could talk to?
No.
Were there any limits placed on what material would be made available to you?
No.
Do you feel that you have had all of the time and all of the information necessary to make a responsible and accurate evaluation in this case?
Absolutely. I mean, I suppose if I had practiced being up here, I might have done a better job at explaining things. But in terms of coming to the opinions that I have and that I've tried to explain as best as I can and my anxiety will allow, I don't think there is anything else I could have done.
you knew going into this that you were evaluating a young man whom the state was seeking to execute. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so you had to have considered, I presume, the fact that he has a high motivation to have you have a favorable opinion of him.
Sure.
Okay.
Of course.
Is that something you considered, or did you just ignore it?
No, I always consider. I always consider that anyone I evaluate, but especially in a case like this where there are potential life-saving motivations, I always consider that. Anytime I'm around attorneys, I always consider the accuracy of the information I'm getting.
And thank you.
Sorry.
All right, on that happy note, we'll take a recess until 1:30. We can all ponder what he means by that. And we'll see you all back here at 1:30. Don't discuss the case with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about it. We'll see you at 1:30. All right,
Okay, so they took a quick recess, and they of course skip over that. But there was a question here, Dr. Heinz Ermitteln. Hey Heinz, good to see you. I've always wanted to ask: are juries allowed dictionaries? And I think you said in specifically like in deliberations. No, generally speaking, no, because any kind of terms that require definitions for the case are usually going to need to be predefined. The two sides are going to need to agree on it. Dictionaries can vary from dictionary to dictionary as to the definitions of certain words. If there's like an offhand word that a witness uses that a witness doesn't understand, I don't know, maybe they make a note of it and ask one of the other jurors what that means. But generally speaking, no, and that's because that can be there can be so many different versions of different definitions depending on the dictionary.
we'll proceed with the redirect examination. We have the witness on the witness stand and the gold jury in the courtroom, and you may proceed.
Dr. Conte, you were asked by the prosecution with regard to the possibility of contamination. That is, that while Menendez had information from sources other than his childhood experiences that he was relating to you. Do you remember that question?
Yes.
And I believe you indicated that you're always concerned with the possibility of contamination. What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, contamination is probably not the best term for what we're talking about. Contamination usually refers to the tainting of evidence by accidentally including some foreign substance in a sample, or by interviewing a small child and someone suggesting things. We think of contamination as accidental influence rather than deliberate influence, or a deliberate effort by a witness to fabricate events. But be that as it may, anytime you're doing an evaluation where the results are going to be used in the law or in treatment planning, it's important to weigh or evaluate the information you're getting. And especially when there is some potential motivation on an individual to minimize, distort, or fabricate, you're searching for some kind of information that will help corroborate or help you know the reliability or know the confidence that you should have in the information that you're getting. So, and that's also true in clinical practice too, although it's a little bit less important in clinical practice because you have more time to work with an individual to get a sense of the accuracy of the information. So I think in these kinds of evaluations, the evaluator is always worried about or concerned about the extent to which what the person is telling you is an accurate depiction of what happened versus meeting some pre-existing or underlying bias.
If someone was going to make up a child abuse experience based on what was in the popular literature, what would be some of the things you would expect to see?
Well, I think probably one of the symptoms of victimization, which has received the most attention in arts, movies, and in popular press, are flashbacks. Flashbacks are a re-experiencing of a traumatic event, either through an image that suddenly comes to you, or some people will describe it as feeling as they felt at the time of the traumatic event. for example, a Vietnam veteran hears a backfire and suddenly feels like he or she is back in the jungles of Vietnam. That's a flashback.
Did Lyle Menendez relate to you any flashbacks of his molestation?
No.
What other popular symptoms would you have expected to hear from somebody who was faking it that
Well,
you did not hear?
That's complicated. It's not just that you would expect to hear it from someone who is faking it, but that when someone describes a symptom which has received a lot of popular attention, another one, for example, is sexual dysfunction. In males, for example, an inability to become sexually aroused and to maintain an erection. Someone could hear about or have heard about that as a problem and say, oh yeah, I have a problem with sex. I think about my father every time I try to have sex with a woman. Someone could say that and still have had sex with their father, but I would treat that symptom with a little more doubt, I think, because that's a very common thing that's talked about.
I know that people often have problems with when people use the term rape versus sex. And like when they're talking about with children, it's like, you know, the R word typically isn't used. And I've noticed him use it that way as well. It's a little strange, but it's something that people still do today. So it's not even necessarily a 1993 thing. It is weird to see it coming from a clinician, though.
About in the literature.
And did Lyle Menendez report any problems in this regard?
No, to the contrary, apparently he's had a lot of girlfriends and has been sexually active with those girlfriends.
Were there any other particular symptoms that would have made you highly suspicious that were not related, that are commonly known? Or is that pretty much the two main ones?
Well, there are other things, but again, it's not that the symptom makes one suspicious, but rather I think one gives less credence to symptoms that have been talked about in the press a lot. And I mean, flashbacks, for example, there are any number of movies in which a victim has had a flashback and it's been acted out dramatically. There are things that Lyle didn't tell me that I think are significant. I mean, some of the physical complaints that are consistent with victimization that the medical records tend to describe. I think that sort of increases believability.
Such as?
Oh, nausea and stomach aches.
So he did not relate to you anything about nausea or stomach aches?
He didn't describe physical symptoms to me really at all, although I did ask. And the fact that they are present in the record and he didn't talk about it, I think increases believability or credibility. Other sort of things that would appear on the face of it innocuous. I mean, I believe it was Alicia Hertz, one of the school counselors, or it might have been a school nurse, where Lyle went to her once and just sort of sat in her presence. He never described that to me, but that neediness, I mean, it's somebody who was really sophisticated in making up a story. I mean, I think they could describe, oh, I was emotionally needy and I used to go sit next to someone and wanted to tell them about it and never had the courage to do it. But he didn't even mention that. So when I read that didn't necessarily confirm sexual abuse, but it certainly confirmed that this was a very needy kid who maybe had something to tell, or at least wanted to be around someone to feel a sense of nurturing and support. I think his not understanding the significance of the stuffed animals or of the leopard he touched or some of those things, his not understanding what he was telling and being embarrassed when he was telling, and sort of, I mean, those all were factors that tended, I think, to increase believability.
Okay. When you were asked by Mrs. Bazanich about Dr. Burgess's testimony about the neurobiological response to fear, I believe you indicated that that's not an area of expertise for you. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But you know Dr. Burgess, is that correct?
Quite well. In fact, she and I have talked about in previous years doing research on the effects of abuse using psychophysiological measures of trauma. I've, in those discussions, have sort of relied on her to be responsible for that part of our discussion. We ultimately didn't write the grant, but we had talked about it, but that would be her area.
And you consulted with her in connection with this case, is that correct?
This case and other cases, yes.
And I take it you have respect for her opinion?
The highest.
And did you rely on her information in this area as being corroborative of the information that you already had?
Yeah, I think her ideas and her understanding that come from nursing and medical expertise support my own understanding from a psychological point of view about hyperarousal and fearfulness.
So would it be fair to say that she's talking about the biological response and your expertise is in the behavioral field more than the physiological? Yes. Okay. And after talking to her, does it appear that both systems, the biological and the behavioral system, get you to the same place in terms of understanding how someone reacts in a fear situation?
Both would appear to get you to the same understanding. I think that the behavioral understanding is far more well developed and supported by a range of research. The psychobiological or biophysiological basis is a new area. It's developing. It is a highly specialized supportive area. I just don't happen to be an expert in that body system kind of analysis.
I believe Mrs. Bazanich asked you if you had an explanation in the biological sense for how two individuals could arrive at the same place in terms of physiologically with their responses, and you indicated you don't have that expertise. Is that correct?
That's what I thought I indicated. Yeah, I don't use that formulation, so I would not apply it to understanding two or more individuals who had been exposed to the same set of traumatic events.
Do you understand within your frame of expertise how two individuals, Lyle and Erik Menendez in this case, could have arrived at the same place at the same time, in this case, with regard to believing that their parents were going to kill them?
Well, yes. I mean, I think although no two children's experiences are identical in any family, I think their common experiences in this extremely disturbed and violent family led them to a somewhat similar place, but more critically, their constant interactions with each other, one feeding information, the other reacting. Their interaction is as much a part of the escalating fear of that last week as anything else. So it's not just that they had two similar sets of perspectives and understanding and views of the family going into it, but they also interacted with each other in a heightened, in a fearful state, in a highly aroused state, and supported each other or kind of fed on each other to increase this anxiety through the last days of their parents' lives.
Did they appear to be looking to each other for interpretation of these cues?
Interpretation, reassurance, a different perspective, yes.
Now, they're looking at cues and trying to understand them. Did you find that there was confusion during this period of time in terms of whether they were accurately reading the cues or not?
Objection calls for a proper opinion.
Good question.
Based on your interview with Lyle, did you have information that he early on understood exactly what was going to go on and never deviated from that position, or did his perspective change during that period of time?
I think his perspective changed. The willingness he had to believe that his life was in danger changed. And so he constantly looked for cues or information from the environment, from his brother, in the behavior of his parents.
Would you have expected, given what you knew of his life experience, that he would go outside the family to look for guidance?
No.
Objection calls for a proper opinion. Start.
Objection sustained. The answer stricken.
Are you aware of anyone else in Lyle's life to whom he was close enough that he would have asked for guidance during this period of time?
Objection sustained. Same objection.
Sustained. You have to rephrase the question.
Was there anybody else, to your knowledge, that Lyle believed had enough information about the family who could have helped him interpret what was going on?
No.
Why is that?
Well, I think there's several factors. First of all, going going into this last week, this is a family where secrecy and not talking about things that were going on inside was a commandment. You didn't talk even to relatives, even close relatives, about things that you had done or your parents had done or your problems. And so going into this, there was a sense of isolation. In addition to that, there was this sense that parents were all powerful, controlling, irrational, potentially violent. And once these series of highly emotional events begin to take place and the fear and the anxiety rise, there is a tunneling in, a sort of losing track of what I've called sort of external reference points, information that would say, oh, come on now, this can't be happening, or, oh, come on, here's a solution, here's a way to escape from it. So it's the family history, it's the way these parents created this family. But in addition to that, the crisis events, the anxiety-producing, fear-producing events of the last week also create a tunneling in. And so I think the sense of isolation and powerlessness that Lyle had the week before became even greater as the anxiety builds and there's a tunneling in or a focusing into what's going on and looking acutely for little signals or cues that are going to tell you how real the danger is or how imminent the danger is.
Mrs. Bazanich asked you if child abuse victims can hate their parents. You remember that question?
Yes.
Did you look in your 60 hours of interviews with Lyle for signs of whether he hated his parents?
Yes, I did.
Did you find any signs he hated his parents?
I found no indication that he hated his parents at all. I would suspect if he is ever in a healing therapy process, some psychotherapist will have to help him sort out his feelings, and it may be that anger is discovered sometime in the future, but I certainly found no awareness of it or no evidence of it in my time with him or in my review of the record.
Would you expect in a successful therapeutic situation that one of the things that would happen is he would learn to be angry because of what had happened?
Pause for speculation.
Overall.
It's not that he learns to be angry, it's that he begins to sort out and understand the range of emotions that are hidden below the surface, that are unconscious. And he may find, not every victim does, but he may find that there is anger because of his experiences and all the losses. Many victims do, but some victims I've had in treatment never become particularly angry.
Mrs. Bazanich asked you if you had seen worse cases of abuse and cited you to children who were locked in closets, etc. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Are you aware that almost 4,000 children a year die at the hands of their parents?
Yes.
Do you consider that worse abuse than happened here?
You know, I struggled with it when I was asked originally. I have no capacity to weigh one person's suffering against another and say, well, this is worse. We have some ideas in the field, some research that talks about how different types, for example, of sexual abuse can be more traumatic, but you may have a relatively less serious, like fondling, which is unwanted, which can't be controlled, which is scary. That can have a profoundly traumatic impact on the individual. So to say that, well, fondling isn't as serious as intercourse, which generally the research says that if you're vaginally raped, you're going to have a more serious impact. But lots of people who are fondled do. So the idea of the level of trauma and the level of impact and saying that, well, one person's suffering is less significant or is going to have less of an impact, I have a great problem with. I mean, certainly a parent killing a child is a very serious, very traumatic event. Now, it tends not to be associated with long-term psychological consequences because the child who is battered dies. So
it's good to hear him say, I'm sorry, I totally interrupted the rest of his answer, but it's good to hear him say that, because it's like, you know, these assumptions that people have about, like, just because it wasn't, this other milestone, people tend to think that like it's not as bad or the emotional impact isn't as bad, but like we have to be very careful about making those kinds of conclusions because you could have a lesser thing happen and it still has like a massive emotional impact on someone. So it's like, I'm happy to hear him make that point.
I'm not even answering it very well now because I think it's a very difficult concept to sort of get your hands around. I mean, what matters is what mattered to the individual who suffered it.
Right.
And I objectively may think, well, being locked in a home and waiting around in foot deep of garbage, that to me, that's a pretty horrible thing because of the way I live. But, it's conceivable that a kid who spends his whole life in garbage doesn't know that that's that bad. And so someone else's experience may be greater. So I think it's just a very problematic area to try to sort of say, well, this is a worst case.
Well, is one thing that you would look at other things that are going on. If that child lives in a house that's a foot deep in garbage, but with parents who are loving and supportive and nurturing, is there a chance that child's going to come out better than someone who lives in a mansion with parents who are not loving, nurturing, and supportive, and in fact are cruel?
Well, sure. Certainly the bond with a parent, especially if it is positive, can overcome a lot of social and environmental difficulties.
In a number of the family situations that you see, is there one strong abusive parent and another parent who is maybe weak and ineffectual, but still loving and supportive?
Quite often, yes.
Is there something unusual about this family in that you have abuse coming from both parents?
Yes, you have abuse, but it's not only abuse, it's high levels of abuse and multiple types of abuse that make this case a lot more complicated than many cases.
And is there is the frequency of abuse a factor? And by that I mean, if the mother is abusive and she is in constant contact with the child, is the regularity of her abuse and the inescapability of her abuse a factor that will affect your opinion?
Well, I think regularity, or what I would call chronicity of abuse, is an issue because it requires more constant adaptation of the victim to that chronic abuse. It doesn't mean, however, that a single powerful abuse incident can't have a profound effect. So it's complicated, but generally, yes, chronicity is a problem because it requires more constant adaptation or coping with that horrible thing. It happens more.
If you have this rather ineffectual parent, but one who tries to help you or tries to support you, or at least explains that the abuser's behavior is not your fault, is that some sort of an ameliorating factor in some homes?
Yeah, I would call it a buffer.
Okay.
It tends to buffer the traumatic effect of the more violent, more abusive parent.
Was there any buffering effect in the Menendez?
No.
If a child does not have this buffering effect, does it give them the impression that whatever's going wrong is their fault and somehow it's their responsibility to solve the problem, to change their behavior or not make mistakes?
Well, yes and no. I think self-blame, feeling responsible for your own abuse, is a not universal, but a quite common characteristic of victims. The buffering effect is almost an independent factor. I mean, even when there is a buffering effect, the abused child can still say, it's my fault, it's my responsibility. If I just did better, if I just tried harder, if I just pleased him or her more, it would somehow stop. And so self-blame is a common characteristic of child abuse.
In a family where this buffer exists, does the child tend to view the buffering parent as an ally in this struggle?
Often, yes.
Were there any allies in the Menendez home for Lyle Menendez?
Well, there was his brother, but and there were some ameliorating factors such as his use of the stuffed animals and his girlfriends, but there was no parental buffer. There was no ally in the adult generation that he could look to.
Mrs. Bazanich asked you if you talked to Dr. Oziel or wanted information from Dr. Oziel. Do you remember that?
Yes,
And you did not make any effort to gather information from him. Is that correct?
that's correct.
Why is that?
Because he's a quack.
Well, as I think I indicated, he is not a terribly credible witness. He seems to have behaved in ways that are considered improper for,
Your Honor, at this
Psych-
point, I would object to this characterization as being improper opinion by this witness.
Because it's incredibly damaging to my case, Your Honor.
All right, did you wish to be heard?
Yes, Your Honor. Sidebar?
Yes.
Dr. Conte, I believe we were addressing the issue of why you didn't seek information from Dr. Oziel. Is that correct?
yes,
Did you have an opinion as to whether he was an ethical therapist?
I did.
And what was that opinion?
He was not.
Did you have an opinion as to whether he was
Oh my God. So Pam has now flagged for the jury that she really doesn't want them to hear this. And now this is Jill Lansing. She has won that objection. And now she's going to go question by question about all the reasons why Dr. Oziel is the absolute worst. Good job. Good job, Pam. Congrats.
a competent therapist?
Yes,
And what was that
he
opinion?
is not, was not.
And did you have an opinion with regard to the practice of creating notes sometimes substantially after sessions are conducted?
Yes, I think they are inherently unreliable.
Were those reasons why you did not go to Dr. Oziel for his advice in this matter?
Yes,
You think his opinions would have been at all helpful to you?
I doubt it.
Mrs. Bazanich asked if you talked to Dr. Summerfield,
Yes.
Mrs. Menendez's therapist. And I believe he saw her approximately 100 times. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
And how much time did you spend talking to Dr. Summerfield?
Just talking or reviewing his notes and talk?
Just talking.
About 2.5 hours.
And how much time did you spend reviewing his notes?
I reviewed them a number of times. I can't give you an exact count.
And in talking to Dr. Summerfield, did he indicate to you how he made his notes?
Yes, he took them contemporaneous to the session with the client.
And did you find those notes helpful in rendering an opinion in this case?
Yes,
Did you rely on them?
yes,
Did they reveal information about Kitty Menendez and her relationship with her sons?
yes,
Did they indicate that when Lyle Menendez was coming home, she expressed jealousy or concerns because when he was around, her relationship with her husband was affected?
yes,
Objection calls for hearsay with strike.
Objection sustained. The answer is no.
Did you have an opinion with regard to the relationship between Kitty Menendez and her son Lyle as it related to Jose?
from,
Well, I also have a note from my colleague. The notes were taken contemporaneously. That means they were taken at the same time the session was going on?
yes,
Did you observe a pattern of jealousy in Kitty Menendez with regard to her son Lyle Menendez?
Objection calls for hearsay and beyond the scope of cross-examination.
Sustained as to the former ground.
Did you find the information from Dr. Summerfield to be corroborative of information you received from Lyle Menendez?
yes,
Did you find it to be corroborative of information you received from other witnesses?
yes,
You were asked if you found it to be inconsistent that a secretive family would send their son to a psychologist.
yes,
And you said it happens often.
yes, I did.
What did you mean by that?
Well, abusers, especially family abusers, make efforts to keep a child from revealing the abuse. That might be bribery, it might be coercion, it might be threat. There's a host of factors that an offender will use to keep a child from disclosing. In addition, there are factors in the child that often warrant against disclosure. And so it's common for abusive parents to send their kids to school or scouting or camps or places outside of their direct control because they believe, justifiably, I think often, that they have done everything they can to reduce the likelihood that that child will reveal abuse. And so kids are routinely sent to doctors, and they may be in therapy for many kinds of problems that are actually associated with abuse, but the parent has no fear that the abuse will be revealed. That's why we've gone to great lengths to train therapists to recognize behaviors which may be indicative of abuse, so that they will ask and try to overcome the coercion and manipulation that the abusive parent has used to keep the child from disclosing the abuse.
Based on your information about Jose Menendez, does he seem to be someone who had some confidence in his own power?
Yes,
Did he seem to be arrogant?
yes,
Based on the information you have about him, do you believe that he could create a situation in which he was confident that his children would not reveal the secrets?
Objection, calls for a topic.
Sustained.
Dr. Oziel testified that one of the first things that he said to clients was that if they revealed child abuse, he would have to report it.
yes,
Were you aware of that?
yes.
And does that type of an admonition sometimes make children reluctant to report abuse? If they know that if they tell the doctor is going to tell the authorities.
Yes.
Why would a child not want the help of the authorities, the intervention in the family?
Well, most kids, many abused kids don't want the abuse revealed. They don't want the secret out. They don't want the consequences that they think will happen. They don't want their own participation in the abusive events revealed. There's been a lot of pressure on them not to tell. I mean, there are a host of reasons that kids won't disclose abuse, and therefore some kids, if they're in a situation with a professional who may report it, then they're not going to talk about it because they're afraid to.
Now, if Kitty and Jose Menendez were sending their son to a therapist from whom they required a waiver of confidentiality, do you think that would be additional insurance against the child ever revealing abuse?
Objection, assume staff not notice.
Rephrase the question, please.
Are you aware that Erik Menendez was required to sign a waiver of confidentiality so that Dr. Oziel could talk to his parents about what he talked about?
Objection, assume staff not notice.
Why don't you modify that by deleting the word required?
Okay. If Erik Menendez signed a waiver of confidentiality, which enabled Dr. Oziel to talk to his parents about what he talked about in therapy, would that be a situation in which the child would be reluctant to discuss his own abuse?
It would have some effect. I think the more profound effect has to do with the relationship between the child and the parent. But yeah, knowing that a release had been signed would have some additional impact in reducing the likelihood that a child might disclose.
You were asked about your interview with Diane Vandermolen and her testimony here that Lyle had complained to her when he was young that he was being touched by his father.
Yes,
Is that correct? You said you spent approximately 8 hours with her,
yes,
and you made some sort of independent determination as to her credibility, I assume?
yes,
And were you aware that the visit to the jail was in June and the revelation to the defense of this information was the following January?
yes.
Now, was there anything about what you knew about her or the circumstances surrounding that information that led you to think that it was reliable?
Yes, I took her to be a credible reporter of events. She revealed information about herself and about the family that was not particularly, it was negative, quite negative about herself and about her cousins and about her family. I mean, if she were lying, I don't know why she would wait so long to tell a lie. If she were going to tell a lie, it would seem to me there are a host of other lies she could have told that would be more supportive. She could have said she came in on Lyle being abused at one time. I mean, if you're going to lie, it just seems to me there are a whole lot more detailed, credible lies that one could tell.
You were asked about the fact that house guests were permitted, that people actually lived in the Menendez home. And I think, obviously, specifically, you've interviewed Alan Anderson, you've interviewed Diane Vandermolen. You're also aware that I think Kathy, another cousin, lived there for some period of time. How is it that a secretive family would permit these house guests, these cousins, to be in the house?
Well, first of all, sexual abuse can take place at a camp with dozens and dozens of people around. I mean, sexual abuse can take.
Weird. Wasn't he the one that referred to BSA before? Boy Scouts of America? Like innocuously, but like that feels like a weird foreshadowing. And by the way, I'm not saying that to like knock Boy Scouts of America. I actually have been a member of Boy Scouts of America myself when I was over 14 and could join what was there at the time co-ed version of it, which is the venture crew. Anyway, and my brothers also were in Boy Scouts and everything. So like lots of experience in like with like Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and also Lithuanian Scouts. Anyway, so but it's interesting in the context of all of this conversation. That's something that they've really dealt with quite a bit. And so it's interesting. We now know, of course, that is one of those things, one of those environments in which these things can absolutely happen, because there have been reports about that kind of thing. Anyway,
Take place with other people in the room asleep. So the fact that there were children who I don't think were regarded as much of a threat to these parents, and in particular relatives of Kitty and her family, and indeed she at some points wasn't regarded as a very significant person. So I don't think it's a very significant factor that there were these children from this sort of non-important side of the family who were present in the home for some periods of time. But unless they were 100% of the time always in the physical presence of Lyle, the fact that they didn't see abuse is really not terribly significant.
How do you explain, they obviously never saw sexual abuse, but they did talk about physical abuse that they witnessed and verbal abuse that they witnessed? How is a family that cares about its image going to let that type of behavior be seen by these cousins?
Well,
Sustained.
Is it consistent with your understanding of that family's dynamics that they would permit this behavior in front of these cousins?
sure, the belt and the physical abuse and some of the psychological abuse doesn't carry the same social stigma that sexual abuse does. And so, especially because they are kids, but also because those behaviors may be regarded in some families as appropriate, it's not surprising that they would see that and not other things.
You were asked about the film that Alicia Hertz testified to seeing, the Brazilian film.
Yes.
And was there any significance to you about Alicia Hertz and what she saw? And
Well, if I remember her testimony correctly, I've never seen the film, but she said it was pornographic. She said that Jose was sort of taunting her and the other guests with this film, kind of implying that they were prudes and there was something wrong with them, and that Jose, had shown it to his own children. Lyle had told me he had seen such a film, although I don't recall that he told me the name of it, and that Alicia Hertz said that it was pornographic.
and is showing pornographic films to children something you consider to be a healthy way to live?
Well, showing pornographic films is not healthy, and showing films that are, even if they weren't pornographic, but some people think they are, and there's a range of variation, if they are that explicit and they include sexuality and violence, then I think it is exceedingly inappropriate.
Do you consider it corroborative in any way of the other information you have that this was a family that stretched sexual boundaries?
No, it's another tip of the iceberg that this is an exceedingly dysfunctional, violent, dysfunctional family. Yes.
You were asked if you rendered a diagnosis of an antisocial personality disorder. Did you find any mental disease or disorder in evaluating Lyle Menendez?
No.
Did you find any personality or character disorder?
No.
And yet you indicate that you feel that he needs therapy. You were asked if you and I had that discussion.
Yes.
And your feeling is that he does?
I don't think there's any question he does. I think he's been exposed to the kinds of coercive family life experiences that produce negative impacts, such as self-esteem and other kinds of problems. He has the capacity for insight. He has the capacity to form a relationship with an evaluator, and therefore, given the will and the opportunity, he certainly could benefit from longer-term psychotherapy.
In evaluating the case, Mrs. Bazanich asked you if you considered the prosecution theory, which was hate. This
Yes.
crime was committed for hate. Did you consider that?
Yes.
And what was your opinion about whether this crime was committed for hate?
You didn't.
I just don't, in the record, in the testimony, but most critically in my evaluation, I just don't find evidence for anger and hate.
At the time that
Oh,
you first started working on the case, the people had other theories
1993 recording technology. Am I right?
they were propounding, such as the case was the crime.
Excuse me, this is argumentative evidence beyond scope.
Well, the way you're phrasing the question sounds like it's leading as well. So if you want to rephrase it or go on to something else.
Mrs. Bazanich asked you your opinion about one of the prosecution theories. Are you aware that they have other theories for the motivation for these killings?
Yes.
And are you aware that money is one of the motivations that they have propounded?
Yes.
And did you form an opinion on that?
Yes.
And what was that?
I just don't find it credible. I mean, these kids had money before. There didn't seem to be controls put on them on how much money they spent. They were going to have money. I think it was pretty clear that they knew that they were out of the will. I suppose you could argue, actually, if something had happened to the parents, they might have less money than they had if the parents were alive.
And their other theory that they've suggested was that somehow this was done because it was fun to commit this perfect crime. Did you consider that theory?
Your Honor, objection. This is beyond the scope of this argument.
Sustained.
You were asked about whether Lyle Menendez was isolated since he was allowed to take trips and go to Europe and go to Australia. Is isolation a concept of how many people are around you?
No, a sense of isolation and powerlessness is something which is conditioned through abuse. You take it with you wherever you are. I mean, it's quite clear, for example, in battered women, that when their husband goes to work or goes on a business trip, they still don't tell about it, and they still don't feel that they can tell about what's happening to them. And so the sense of isolation really is a perception and a feeling that the battered person takes with him or her wherever she goes. It's not physical isolation.
Okay. And are some of those battered women married to men who are gone for periods of time?
Yes.
Long distance truck drivers, et cetera, and they may not be in the house on a
Business trips or whatever.
daily
Yes.
basis. Does that mean that those women aren't afraid when they're back in the presence of their batterer?
No.
So when Lyle is living in Princeton for part of the time between 86 and 89, did you find that he was operating totally independently at that time and that whatever impact his childhood had would be gone?
No, he had constant contact with his parents. He had phone calls. Both of the parents would periodically drop in. He had contact with his father's family, his cousins and aunt and uncle back there. So he had constant reminders of their influence and control.
You were asked about whether corporal punishment is sometimes, there can be situations in which it's an appropriate response. I take it you weren't including beating with a belt in that.
No, I'm talking about relatively minor physical correction, especially in young kids or kids who are developmentally delayed and there is no other way in a very dangerous situation to stop the behavior. I think generally corporal punishment is not appropriate parenting.
What about punching in the stomach?
I cannot conceive ever of a reason to punch a child with a fist, or for that matter, to hit a child. Maybe a swat on the bottom for some age kids, but certainly not a closed fist ever.
Now,
I wonder how many professionals, in that are psychologists or psychiatrists would even say that much today, right? Like even a swift hit on the bottom, I don't know. Maybe not. I would be curious to find out, like, has that changed? Because I feel like that's changed, at least generally speaking, how like society talks about it. But yeah, anyway, it's so fascinating to think about, like, what would be different today versus in 1993.
information about being punched in the stomach one instance comes from Lyle Menendez, another one comes from Peter Cano, an uncle. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And was there any impact on your evaluation by virtue of the fact that when that was witnessed and Peter Cano complained about it to Jose Menendez, he was asked to leave the house?
I think the significance is that the family was successful in communicating to Lyle that there was no help and that there would be a consequence to anyone who tried to help, for example, by discussing it.
You were asked about the testimony regarding the Big Five.
Yes.
And whether that affected your opinion. Is that correct?
Yes.
What is your opinion with regard to the impact of that testimony?
Objection, improper opinion.
Rephrase the question.
Okay. You were asked if that affected your opinion in terms of the believability of Lyle Menendez. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did it?
No.
Why not?
Well, I suppose it seems like such a small point that maybe I get confused when I talk about it. My understanding of the testimony that I read, and I think I saw portions of this, is that there is some confusion. Lyle didn't live here. He got directions about the store he went to. He may have been confused about the store that he went to. They were in the store. It's not hard for me to imagine in a gun store selling whatever it is that you might hear information from other customers or from the clerk, where you get an idea that a waiting period is necessary. There may be, if it's true, and I assume that it is, that there were pellet guns or starter pistols, something in the cabinet. There may have been some confusion about that. It's like an unnecessary detail. I mean, if you're going to lie and make up a story, why bring this in when it seems to hurt your case? I mean, if there's no way to find out about it, exclude it altogether. So it doesn't seem to me to be terribly significant in understanding what I was called here to understand.
Would you consider, or did you consider the fact that in relating the events of the last days of Kitty and Jose Menendez's life, that neither Lyle nor Erik Menendez ever testify to a specific threat?
Yes, I did.
What is the significance of that to you?
Well, again, if you're going to lie, that's probably the most critical time to lie, is to say there was a direct threat. Our life was threatened. Mom said that she'd threatened to poison in the past, and within a week we'd all be dead from poisoning. Or, Dad said he'd kill us before the movie was over or something. I mean, that seems to me to be the time where, given all of the other information about how violent and how scary these parents were, that would be the time to come up with a really good, clear threat.
And do you sense in watching the testimony of Lyle Menendez that he understands that other people may not see the danger as he saw it?
Yes.
Objection sustained. The answer is stricken.
Did you sense in talking to Lyle that he understood that his perception of danger may not be the perception of danger of other people who didn't know his parents?
I think from time to time in talking to him, he had that understanding. But there are other times in talking to him where everything I knew about his life and about his parents, I thought he was at risk too. So,
Your Honor, I move to strike. I thought he was at risk.
All right. The answer is stricken. The jury is admonished to disregard that opinion in its entirety. Ask something else, please.
Did you, you were asked about,
It's a little distracting. Okay. All right. They're getting, okay, we'll send somebody back and see if we can quiet them down just a wee bit.
Must be some
How much
chatter in
longer
the
do you think
hallway.
could be?
probably about 10 minutes.
Any recross?
Yes.
Okay, let's give them a break. Tell them to take a 15-minute break. All right, as soon as the jury leaves, we'll resume here. All right, you may proceed. You folks can now see the other side of it. When you were waiting all that time and we had the other jury here, it just happens that things tend to take a little longer than the estimates here. So you may proceed.
Thank you. You were asked about Lyle's pattern of spending money after his parents died.
yes,
And I think it's fair to say he spent a substantial amount of money after they died.
Yes.
Is that correct?
yes.
Was there any pattern with regard to these purchases and how they took place that you thought was significant? In terms of who he talked to, or
Yes.
what was that?
Well, my understanding is before he actually spent money, he asked for advice from an uncle or a bodyguard or someone else, almost as if to ask permission or is it okay?
What was the significance of that?
Well, I think it shows ambivalence. I think it's consistent with spending as a grieving process, a kind of nurturing, kind of giving to self, trying to deal with grief.
Was he the type of person, in your opinion, who made decisions himself or who always had decisions made for him?
I think he was the type of person that had all significant decisions and many insignificant decisions made for him.
And would this be consistent with that pattern as well?
Yeah.
When you were asked about picking up the shells afterwards because of the fingerprints, if someone were planning a homicide, would you expect that they would do something to prevent fingerprints being on the shells to begin with?
Objection, beyond the scope, excuse me, lack of expertise.
Why don't you rephrase the question? It's a little confusing.
When the question was asked about the picking up the shells and whether this showed some sort of a calm state of mind, you remember that question?
Yes.
And do you have an opinion about that in terms of whether that behavior did reflect a calm state of mind or something else?
It didn't seem to me to reflect a calm state of mind and didn't seem to reflect a well thought out plan.
And did calling the police while the shells are still in the car that's parked out front seem to be a calm, well thought out plan?
Not real bright, no.
You were asked about the reloading of the weapons and the presence of the bird shot and whether that had any effect on your opinion. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And what is your opinion with regard to the state of mind and the state of the ammunition? And what significance did that have for you, if any?
Well, it didn't strike me when I heard it as a well thought out plan. I mean, it seems to me if it was planned, you'd had the right ammunition in from the time you had the guns. It sounded to me chaotic and confusing and fearful.
Was there any significance to you to the fact that Lyle Menendez testified that he had extra ammunition in his pocket and yet he went out to the car
Again, fear, irrationality, confusion.
instead of just reaching in your pocket and reloading in the room?
Right.
Mrs. Bazanich was talking about the plans with Perry Berman as being an alibi. Did you consider the phone call to Perry Berman and the arrangement to meet at the Taste of LA as setting up an alibi?
Well, it certainly wasn't a very good alibi. I mean, it seems to me that if you'd want an alibi that was iron tight, that was really good one. And so if you sort of say you're going to be someplace and then you're not there, that's not a very good one. I mean, when I heard it described by Lyle, it sounded to me like a social event that was being planned, something to do.
And you were asked about whether the events that have been described following the death of the parents, the getting rid of the guns and the going to the movies and going to the Taste of LA, whether it would be important to you to know whether that could be accomplished within the 67 minutes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And did you have information that it could be accomplished within the 67 minutes?
Yes, you told me that it had been timed a number of times and it could be done. Now, the state apparently has a different view, and that's what I was referring to.
Okay, the fact that they're asking the question suggests to you they have a different view?
Presumably, yes.
And you talked about the frantic calls. Strike that, please. You were asked if there was any corroboration for the ripping off of the hairpiece, and you said that you were aware that there were frantic calls to Jose at his mother's house in New York.
Yes.
And how is it you have that information?
Sustained.
Did you attempt to interview people to gather corroborating information?
Yes.
And was that one of the items that you gathered corroboration in?
Yes.
In evaluating whether whether the killings of Kitty and Jose Menendez were planned and organized or whether they were the result of fear, did you consider the fact that Lyle and Erik Menendez didn't have movie tickets to show as an alibi?
Yes.
Did you consider the fact that although there were guns in the house that belonged to Kitty and Jose Menendez, they didn't plant the guns somewhere in
Yes.
the room? Are those all elements that went into your belief in the concept that this was a crime committed out of fear?
Yes, I think especially the guns, because that would have been quite easy to do.
You were asked about the conversation that took place on Thursday night between Lyle and his father. And as he described the conversation to you, I think Mrs. Bazanich asked you if he could have made that conversation up because he'd had a number of other conversations with his father. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did you rely at all on information you had about how Jose behaved in the business world in evaluating whether this seemed to be a credible conversation that's being described to you?
Yes.
And can you tell me about that?
Sustained.
Did you find it to be consistent with information you had about how Jose Menendez treated other people in the business world?
Yes.
And what particular characteristics were reflected in that you relied on?
Sustained.
These are, Your Honor,
Let's move on to something else here. We're just bogged down in getting personal opinions about everything from this witness. Go on to something else.
you were asked about corroboration. Remember whether
Yes.
there was corroboration for Lyle Menendez and the things that he told you?
Yes.
And you've indicated that you interviewed a great number of people, read a great number of reports. Did you feel that those corroborated the information he gave you?
Yes. And there's more. I found more than I normally would find in a case.
And Lyle Menendez told you that he was afraid starting on Thursday night. Is that correct?
Yes.
And when you read the testimony of the sea captain and his behavior on the boat on Saturday night, the night before his parents died, did you find his description of Lyle and Erik Menendez's behavior to be corroborative of what it was he had told you?
Yes.
And what was that? What is your what is your opinion with regard to whether, as a result of Lyle Menendez's experiences, he believed he was in fear of imminent danger that night?
I believe that he was.
Thank you.
All right, any recross?
Dr. Conte, you're not an advocate in this matter, are you?
Absolutely not.
She always
But you
asks
are
them.
aligned with the defense in this case, correct?
I'm an expert witness that was brought into this case by the defense. That's correct.
She always asks if they're an advocate.
Any personal opinions about the death penalty which you think might affect your opinion in this case?
No.
You indicated that some of the relatives that you spoke with were exceedingly ambivalent about saying bad things about the Menendez family.
Yes.
Okay, did you review the testimony of Marta Cano when she talked about her sister-in-law, Kitty Menendez?
Yes.
Would you characterize the things she said about her sister-in-law as exhibiting exceeding ambivalence in saying bad things about her sister-in-law?
No, I don't think Jose's family had much reluctance in saying bad things about Kitty.
You indicated that not all parents love their children, correct?
Correct.
Would you agree that not all children love their parents?
Yeah.
When you first went to the county jail to interview Lyle Menendez, is there a reason that you did not ask to see a list of the other visitors that he had had prior to your going to see him?
No.
Did you ever make an attempt to examine his cell where he was being housed
No,
in
I
jail?
was told by the deputies that I would not be allowed to go back to the cell.
Did you ever ask
why
him what
wouldn't
kind
you?
of reading materials he had had during the period of time in the 2 years before you had seen him?
I didn't do a systematic survey, but I did discuss with him how he had spent his time and the kinds of things he had been reading. But I
So what is she getting at? Did you check under his pillow to see if he's been reading the DSM-3?
didn't do a thorough survey.
Now, are you aware of the fact that Dr. Oziel's testimony documented the fact that Mr. Menendez was an abusive and controlling father?
Yes.
So to the extent that Dr. Oziel agreed with you in that particular regards, his testimony would be reliable. Is that correct?
Well, yes.
All right. And are you aware of the fact that Erik Menendez in his testimony indicated that many of the things that Dr. Oziel had testified to did in fact happen?
Yes.
Right. And did that in any way cause you to become curious about the other contents of Dr. Oziel's
No.
notes?
No, someone can be reliable on 90%, and on the most critical 10% of information, you're going to be totally unreliable.
Boom. Great. Wonderful.
Now it could be true of this defendant as well, couldn't it?
Well, it's true of all human beings.
I believe you indicated that one of the things you were concerned about is that there was a waiver of confidentiality executed by Erik Menendez, correct?
I said it was one small factor, yes.
All right. And you are aware of the fact that after his parents' deaths, neither of the brothers would have had to execute that kind of waiver because there was no parent to tell anything to, correct?
Yes.
You indicated that chronicity of abuse is something that you consider to be somewhat significant, correct?
Yes.
And during the period from 1986 to 1989, when Lyle Menendez was often not present in the family home, the chronicity would be abated, correct?
Correct. Depends on what we were talking about chronicity for. A chronic severe abuse early in life, later in life, it is no longer necessary to repeat those abusive acts, either to produce the effect or produce a fearfulness.
Yes, but if one continues to repeat the acts, that has a stronger effect on the recipient than if those acts stop for a period of time, correct?
Depending on what impact we're talking about. For example, let's say some kind of coping strategy, such as the use of alcohol. The effect of chronic and severe abuse can cause alcohol dependence, and it's not necessary for the abuse to be repeated for there still to be an alcohol or abuse problem. Children can be abused very early in life, have a sense of fearfulness that is there to be triggered, and the abuse doesn't have to reoccur to reaffirm that fearfulness.
However, chronicity is something that would increase the fearfulness, isn't that correct?
It could, sure.
Now, you indicated that you read the testimony or the interview of Alicia Hertz regarding this movie that I questioned you about, correct?
Yes.
And you're aware of the fact that one person's pornography is another person's normal viewing material, correct?
I think that, yes.
And you're aware of the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court can't even define obscenity in any meaningful way.
That's right. That's why I specifically said when I was talking to Ms. Lansing that it simply is not Alicia Hertz's definition of that as pornographic, but rather the depiction of violence and sexuality with children, which is inappropriate. It's not the definition of it being pornographic that concerns me as much as the acts that were portrayed in that film, according to Alicia Hertz.
And you're aware of the fact that there are documentary aspects to that film, correct?
Yes.
Now, you indicated that you think Lyle Menendez needs therapy, correct?
Yes.
Do you think he needs therapy because he killed his parents?
I think he needs therapy for his entire life.
Do you think there's anyone who wouldn't benefit from psychological therapy?
Yes.
There's some people who won't, correct?
Well, there's some people who won't benefit from it, and there are some people who don't need it. Those are two different issues.
All right, for those who need it, do you think there's anyone who wouldn't benefit from it?
Yes.
That would be someone who's what, a total sociopath or something like that?
Well, someone who doesn't want it, is not willing to look inward, doesn't have the tolerance for the anxiety and the process. There are lots of reasons that people don't benefit or can't benefit from therapy.
And you indicated that the confusion over the Big Five in Santa Monica is something that you don't consider to be significant, correct?
Correct.
So would it be fair to say that you don't consider it significant that these guns were purchased 120 miles away using false identification? You don't consider that significant either?
Well, it's significant to what issue?
Well, significant to this fear that Lyle Menendez was acting under in the 5 days before his parents' death.
I don't think it's inconsistent. In fact, I think it's consistent with fear to spend as much time away from the house as you can. And if San Diego is one of the ways to spend as much time out of the house as possible, that's not inconsistent with fear.
And you think that using a false identification is also not inconsistent with fear. Is that correct?
Correct.
As a matter of fact, are there any of the facts that I've related to you or that have been related to you in your research which are inconsistent with your theory that this crime occurred as a result of fear?
You're asking me after being here all day to remember every fact you've related to me, and I don't see how I could possibly do that.
All right, but I'm asking you during the period of time that you've had this case. You've had it for about, what, 2.5 years?
No,
2.5 years.
less than 2 years, I think.
Well, I think you said January of 92.
Right.
Okay, I'm sorry. Less than 2 years. During that period of time, have you ever thought to yourself, gee, there's a fact here that I don't think fits in with my theory?
No, I thought it all the time. I worried about it all the time.
But
I would often then go back the next time and try to pursue it more.
But you have found a logical explanation within your theory for all of the events that occurred between August the 15th and August the 20th, correct?
I don't know whether I have found a logical explanation. I have found an understanding based on my clinical experience, my understanding of battering and its effect on individuals. I have been able to understand why the events took place.
Okay, so rather than having a logical explanation, you have a psychological explanation for what happened. Is that correct?
Rephrase the question.
So would it be fair to say then that you have a psychological explanation for all of the events between August the 15th and August the 20th?
Yes, a psychological understanding. Psychological understandings have to incorporate reality.
Dr. Conte, you indicated one thing that you would have expected to have seen in staging the crime scene would have been taking the family's rifles and somehow using them in order to stage the crime scene by the defendants. Remember your testimony in that
Yes.
regard? You're aware of the fact that shortly after the crime, Lyle Menendez indicated to the police that it was his father's business that might have been the cause for this killing.
Yes.
Correct? And you're aware of the fact that on other occasions, he either directly or indirectly pointed to the mafia as being a potential perpetrator of this crime.
Sure.
So planting firearms in his parents' arms at the time would have been contradictory to this theory. In other words, if it's a hit, normally the hittee is not armed at the time. Correct?
Well, if it's a hit, I don't think you normally use shotguns either, but I'm not sure what you're asking me.
Well, what I'm asking you is that if one wanted the crime scene to look like the people were taken unawares and were unarmed at the time, one wouldn't arm the victims, correct?
I guess not, probably not.
And if one had an idea of of the way that an organized crime killing occurs that is inconsistent with your victim being armed with a rifle, then you wouldn't put a rifle in the victim's arms, correct?
I guess if that's what was one's understanding, yeah.
Now, if at the time one wanted to tell the police it was self-defense, then it would make more sense to have armed Mr. and Mrs. Menendez with the rifles, correct?
Yeah.
But as in fact, what the defendants told the police on the night of the 21st was that it was something to do with the father's business and that his business included seedy people.
Yeah, I think there were vague allusions to seedy people in the mob or mafia or something. That's correct.
And you were aware of the fact that Mr. Menendez was involved in a business that is the video business, components of which had some organized crime connections, correct?
I do not know that, no.
Okay, so you're not aware of the fact that that video distribution of pornography is very prevalent in the Van Nuys area, for instance. You're not aware of that fact.
Well, I believe that Mr. Menendez was involved in commercial videos, not in the distribution of pornographic videos.
Right, so he wasn't involved in pornography, correct?
You're talking about his business.
Right.
Right.
But you're aware of the fact that one of the businesses that was bought by Live Entertainment had, in fact, previous to being bought by Live Entertainment, had some pornographic overtones, which Mr. Menendez cleaned up. Are you aware of that?
At this moment, I don't recall it, no.
Are you aware of the defense theory that Lyle Menendez's life at the time of his parents' killings was, in fact, going along just fine, and that he interrupted his life in order to help his brother? Are you aware of
It's
that?
not a theory. That's my understanding of what took place.
All right, well, but you've indicated that he was this very abused child.
Yes.
Okay, how is it then that he was this very abused child who was suffering from fear and reacting to his parents' responses, and his life was going along very well? How do you reconcile those two?
Well, it's not hard to reconcile at all. I mean, people who are victims of horrible child abuse can nonetheless have successful businesses or can go to school or what have you. His life, in many ways, and I think I testified to this at least twice already, his life in many ways was better than it had been. His father was paying less attention to tennis. He had a condo to go back to. He had a girlfriend. You know, in that objective real world sense, very much like a battered woman has a family and powerful brothers or something to rely on. He had this other life, but back in California with his brother, unable to run away, fearing of his father, he functioned as an abused child. I don't think that's inconsistent at all.
And you're not an advocate for Lyle Menendez, is that correct? Doctor?
I think I've said that, yes.
Okay, Dr. Conte, you gave an analogy this morning about Jackie Kennedy's reaction when she saw her husband's head blown off.
Yes.
And you used it as an analogy to Lyle Menendez going back and picking up the shotgun shells, correct?
To that whole post-event behavior, yes.
But you're not meaning to suggest that Jackie Kennedy was acting inappropriately after she'd shot her husband?
No.
Because she didn't.
I didn't say she did.
All right, so the analogy fails because she was not involved in the killing of her husband, but Lyle Menendez was involved in the killing of his husband.
Well, ma'am, the analogy to how one acts in a highly fearful, violent involvement, I don't think is an inappropriate analogy.
Yeah, she's trying to be like, well, it's inappropriate because, or it's not a good analogy because of the fact that they were involved, and so therefore their behavior was inappropriate. Jackie Kennedy's behavior was not inappropriate, but like, so it's what she's trying to nail in. But his response is to be fair, he's like, no, here's why it is an appropriate analogy. And
Anything
that's
else?
it. Oh, nope, there is a redirect.
You were asked if Lyle told the police that his father's seedy business associates might have been responsible for the killings. And you've read the transcripts of both the night that the parents died and also an interview in September with Detective Zoller, haven't you?
Yes.
And the night that his parents died, Sergeant Edmonds was pressing Lyle for an explanation on who could have done this. Is that correct?
Correct.
And he indicates that there's a number of explanations that don't seem logical to him. Is that correct?
Yes.
He says it's, somebody suggested it might have been a burglary, but I don't think that's it. I don't think it was my mother. And he keeps getting pressed for an explanation and then eventually volunteers it may have been something to do with my dad and his business associates. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then on September 17th, when he's interviewed by Detective Zoller in New Jersey, he specifically says it wasn't a burglary or a robbery. And it wasn't, I don't believe it was the mafia. And he basically disavows all other explanations for the crime outside of themselves. Is that correct?
That's my recollection of that statement. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I have nothing further.
One question.
All right.
Connie, you're aware of the fact that Lyle Menendez became frightened that the mafia might do something to him because he had pointed the finger at them, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. We'll take a recess until 20 minutes after the
All
hour,
right.
ladies and gentlemen. Don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form any final.
Okay, that's it for that. Okay, so now we have finished the testimony of Dr. John Conte. In the next episode, we will be going on to the next witness. Who is the next witness? Hang on. Let me see if I can scroll down and see. Next witness should be, let's see, Joan Vandermolen and Patricia Anderson. Interesting. Okay. Okay. Well, cool. So, all right. But otherwise, we've got the Karen Reed trial that is, going to be starting anytime soon. So I want to be as prepared as possible for that. So far, it does not appear that a jury has been seated. I don't know how many they have seated. I'm not exactly sure. I've been loosely following while we've been streaming at the same time, kind of multitasking. And so I haven't seen any sort of big announcements on that. But hopefully they'll seat a jury soon and we can start getting into the opening statements and the witness testimony because this is a highly anticipated case, of course. So, other than that, thank you so much for joining me. I know this is a very heavy case, and it's kind of tough to watch sometimes because of some of the discussions that come up. And otherwise, thank you so much. Thank you for joining. Thank you for whether you were engaging in the chat or commenting in the on replay or just lurking. I appreciate every single one of you. Thank you to folks that have chosen to be members to support the channel. Appreciate all of you guys as well, and the folks that are my wonderful mods, because the mods help to make sure that this remains a positive viewing experience overall as people are coming in and bringing their different perspectives and agreeing and disagreeing in a way that is productive. So, okay, guys, thank you so much for everything, and I will see you guys in the next video.